Welcome to Hauntales, where darkest stories come alive. I know many of you tune into these tales to drift off to sleep, so settle in, relax, and get comfortable. Whether you're lying in bed or curled up on the couch, let the whispers of these chilling encounters carry you away. Before we begin tonight's story, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more spine-tingling tales, and let me know in the comments where are you listening from, and what time is it. I love seeing how far our stories travel. For the best experience, use your headphones, close your eyes, and let every word sink deep into your mind. Now we begin our stories for tonight. Marked by darkness. Mandy Cole had always been a grounded, intelligent young woman, known for her sharp wit and determined spirit. At 21, she was in her third year of college, majoring in psychology, a field she'd always been drawn to, fascinated by the human mind and its complexities. Being away from home had been both exhilarating and challenging. Freedom was intoxicating, but the pressures of academic life weighed heavily on her shoulders. She came from a close-knit family, one that cherished tradition and valued the kind of steady, conventional life she had once envisioned for herself. College, however, changed her in ways she hadn't anticipated. The more time she spent in the city, the more she felt a dissonance growing between her past and the life she now wanted to create. Moving away from home felt like a major step, one that came with excitement but also a creeping sense of dread. It wasn't that she didn't want to leave, she did, but the safety net of home and family had always been there for her, even when she didn't need it. Mandy had always been the kind of person others gravitated toward, though she hardly saw herself that way. Growing up in a small town, she was the quiet one, always with her head in a book or a sketch pad. At first, college life was everything she had imagined: independence, new friends, late-night study sessions. She quickly settled into her routine, finding comfort in the anonymity that came with being one of thousands on campus. She majored in psychology, fascinated by the inner workings of the mind, hoping that understanding others might help her understand herself. Classes were challenging but rewarding, and she threw herself into her studies, balancing her workload with a part-time job at a local cafe. Though Mandy had always been an overachiever, the pressure of balancing school and work began to weigh on her. Her grades remained high, but she started pulling back from socializing. Her roommates noticed the shift, though she chalked it up to stress and deadlines. Still, they would go out on weekends while Mandy stayed back, citing essays and exams as excuses. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. More and more, she felt like she didn't quite belong, like an outsider watching everyone else enjoy the college experience she was supposed to be having. That nagging feeling of being out of place only grew stronger as the months passed. She often wondered if she had made the right choice, moving away from her family and friends to a city that still didn't feel like home. She rarely called her parents, not wanting to burden them with her growing sense of unease. They had enough on their plates. Instead, she kept it all inside, convinced that she would eventually adjust. After all, this was supposed to be what everyone went through when they left for college, right? A little homesickness was normal. But the homesickness wasn't the problem. It was something deeper, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. Nights were the worst. After long days of classes and work, Mandy would lie awake in her bed, staring at the ceiling, her thoughts racing. Sometimes she would drift off, only to be jolted awake in the early hours of the morning by a vague sense of discomfort. She would feel a heaviness in the room, a weight pressing down on her chest, as if the air itself had thickened around her. It was subtle at first, easy to dismiss as exhaustion or the overactive imagination of someone who spent too much time studying the mind. Her friends started to drift away, sensing her withdrawal. Mandy wasn't the same lively, easygoing person they'd met during orientation. She became quieter, moodier, and spent more time alone in her room. On the rare occasions when she did go out with them, she was distant, her mind elsewhere, leaving her friends to talk among themselves while she stared blankly into the distance. They stopped inviting her after a while. It was during these isolated nights when the strangeness truly began. It started small, a misplaced item here, a flicker of lights there, things she could easily brush off as coincidences, but with each passing day, the unease grew. Mandy's college life had been relatively uneventful at first, the usual whirlwind of adjusting to a new environment, making friends, and balancing the pressures of coursework. She had always been the quiet type, reserved but friendly, with a sharp wit hidden beneath her shy exterior. College was a chance to reinvent herself, to step out from the shadow of her older siblings and establish her own identity. Her time away from home was supposed to be a period of growth and discovery, but instead, it began to feel like she was losing control. As the semester wore on, Mandy's days grew longer and lonelier. She continued to bury herself in her coursework, hoping that the intense focus would drown out the strange feelings gnawing at her. Every now and then she'd catch herself staring out of the large windows in the campus library, her mind drifting far from the textbooks spread before her. The thought of going back to her apartment, once a place of quiet refuge, now filled her with a subtle sense of dread she couldn't quite explain. She couldn't pinpoint when the shift happened, but it started subtly, almost like a whisper at the back of her mind. Small things she could easily dismiss as her own distraction. Objects seemed to move around in her dorm room. At first it was laughable, her keys disappearing from the table only to show up in the kitchen, or her textbooks being rearranged on her desk. Maybe she was overworked, or maybe her roommate was playing pranks. Mandy brushed it off, focusing on her studies and her part-time job at the campus library, but something lingered in the back of her mind, a nagging sensation that refused to go away. Her apartment had always been a little cold, with drafty windows and the faint smell of musk lingering in the hallways, but lately it felt even colder. The kind of cold that crept into her bones and left her shivering under blankets, no matter how high she cranked up the thermostat. Mandy tried to tell herself it was just the changing seasons, winter creeping in early, as it sometimes did in this part of the country, but the cold didn't feel natural. It felt deliberate, like the walls were exhaling icy breath in her direction. On one particularly frigid evening, Mandy sat at her small desk, trying to finish an essay for her abnormal psychology class. The glow from her laptop cast long, eerie shadows on the walls, and the only sounds were the rhythmic tapping of her keyboard and the occasional hum of traffic outside her window. Yet, every so often she found herself pausing, her fingers hovering above the keys, as if listening for something. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but there was a sound, a soft creak, like the floorboards groaning under someone's weight. She glanced over her shoulder, eyes scanning the darkened corners of her room. There was nothing there, just the usual clutter of textbooks, laundry, and the chair pushed against her desk. Still, the unease lingered. She turned back to her essay, but the words on the screen blurred together, her focus unraveling. The creaking continued, and this time it was followed by a barely audible whisper, like wind slipping through a crack in the wall. Mandy's skin prickled with goosebumps. She decided to take a break, rubbing her temples and pushing away from the desk. Moving through the small apartment, she tried to shake off the unsettling feelings. Grabbing a glass of water from the kitchen, she stood by the window and gazed out at the street below. The city was alive with noise, cars honking, people talking, and distant sirens wailing in the night. Everything outside seemed normal, but within her apartment, an oppressive silence weighed heavily on her. She felt like she was being watched, though she couldn't pinpoint from where or by what. The noises returned in the following nights, always faint, always just on the edge of her perception. Mandy told herself it was the building settling, or perhaps one of her neighbors moving around late at night. but deep down she knew better. The creaking seemed to follow her movements, starting when she entered her room and stopping the moment she left. The whispers, too, became more frequent, so soft that she couldn't make out any words, but constant enough to gnaw at her nerves. Over the next few weeks, the unease grew. Mandy started to feel constantly watched, like invisible eyes were following her every movement. She told herself it was stress, that being away from her family for the first time was simply causing anxiety. But no matter how much she tried to rationalize it, the feeling of being observed never left her. It hung over her like a weight, growing heavier with each passing day. The atmosphere around her changed. Her dorm room, once a cozy haven, now felt oppressive. The air seemed colder, the shadows longer. Sometimes late at night she would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling a creeping sense of dread she couldn't explain. It was as though something was lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. She began leaving the lights on, hoping the warmth and brightness would chase away the strange, suffocating sensation that had begun to envelop her. There were moments when the silence was deafening. Alone in her room, Mandy could hear her own heartbeat thudding in her ears. The quiet wasn't peaceful, it was eerie, unnerving. Sometimes she thought she could hear faint noises scratching at the walls, a soft thump from across the room, or a rustle as if someone or something was shifting nearby. She would get out of bed and check the room, finding nothing but her own shadow. Everything was always in its place, but the unease wouldn't leave her. One night, as she was typing out an essay late into the evening, her laptop screen flickered. The lights in the room dimmed for a second, plunging her into near darkness. Her heart skipped a beat, but just as quickly, the light returned, and the screen stabilized. Mandy brushed it off, thinking it must have been a glitch, but that brief moment left her rattled. As she closed her laptop to get ready for bed, the room felt colder than ever, a chill settling into her bones that no amount of blankets could warm. The next day, things grew even stranger. While grabbing coffee at her usual spot near the library, she felt someone brush past her. She turned, expecting to see a fellow student, but there was no one there. Shrugging it off, she went about her day. Yet it kept happening on the way to class, in the grocery store, even at home. She felt like someone was always near, just out of sight. There were no footsteps, no voices, but that sensation of being shadowed was becoming constant, inescapable. In class, she started noticing her notes were different. She would write down her professor's lecture, only to glance back at her notebook later and find odd scribbles in the margins. At first, they were small, a few marks that could have easily been mistakes. But they began to grow bolder, more deliberate. Strange symbols that Mandy didn't remember writing. It was unnerving, but she told herself it was nothing. Maybe she was doodling absent-mindedly during lectures, nothing to worry about. Despite the growing strangeness, Mandy pushed through, determined not to let her imagination get the best of her. She kept to her routine classes, work, studying, and occasionally calling home to check in with her parents. But those calls became increasingly difficult. Her mother's cheerful voice, once a comfort, now grated on her. Mandy found herself snapping at her parents for no reason, irritated by their concern. She could hear the hurt in their voices, but instead of apologizing, she withdrew further, avoiding their calls altogether. Her dreams started to change around this time as well. What had once been harmless snippets of daily life transformed into unsettling nightmares. She would wake up drenched in sweat, her heart racing, her mind replaying fragments of visions she couldn't fully remember. One dream, however, kept recurring. In it, she was standing alone in her apartment, but everything was wrong. The walls seemed to pulse with a faint, sickly light, and the air was thick and suffocating. She could feel something lurking just beyond her line of sight, a presence that watched her from the shadows, waiting. Every time she turned to confront it, she would wake up. By now, the line between her waking life and her nightmares had begun to blur. She started noticing fleeting shapes in her peripheral vision, dark, human-like figures that vanished the moment she turned to look. She dismissed it as exhaustion, the result of too many sleepless nights, but the sightings became more frequent. At first, they only appeared in the corners of her vision, quick enough to be mistaken for tricks of the mind. But soon they lingered longer, their outlines more defined, their presence more real. One afternoon, as she walked across campus, Mandy spotted one of the figures reflected in the glass doors of the library. Her heart skipped a beat as she whirled around, but there was no one behind her. She stood there, frozen, staring at her own reflection in the glass. For a moment she thought she saw someone standing just behind her reflection, watching her with cold, empty eyes. Then it was gone, leaving her breathless and disoriented. She left campus early that day, her hands trembling as she gripped her bag, the feeling of being watched following her all the way home. The paranoia grew in the days that followed. Every noise, every shadow felt like a warning. The once familiar apartment now seemed alien, as though it belonged to someone or something else. Mandy found herself dreading the nights, knowing that sleep would only bring more nightmares, more glimpses of the figure stalking her. She tried to talk herself out of it, to rationalize what was happening, but the fear had already taken root deep within her mind, feeding off her growing sense of isolation. It all escalated. As she was brushing her teeth one night, in the shared bathroom down the hall, she glanced at the mirror. For a brief moment, her reflection seemed wrong. Her face was still hers, but it was twisted somehow, as though she was looking at a funhouse mirror. Her mouth seemed to stretch into a sneer, her eyes darker, colder. She blinked and shook her head, the reflection snapping back to normal. Mandy stared at herself, her heart racing. She laughed it off, but it wasn't a genuine laugh, it was forced, a feeble attempt to convince herself that everything was fine. The incident with the mirror rattled her deeply. Over the next few nights, she avoided looking at her reflection altogether, but the sense of being watched intensified, growing more invasive, more suffocating. Mandy started waking up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, her heart pounding in her chest. The feeling of a presence in the room was undeniable now, like something was standing right beside her, hovering over her as she slept. The next morning, after a particularly restless night, Mandy woke to find something chilling. Her desk chair, which she always left tucked neatly under the desk, was pulled out, as if someone had been sitting there, watching her sleep. She stared at it, her blood running cold. The sense of unease that had been building for weeks finally boiled over. Mandy tried to convince herself that she had moved it herself and forgotten, but deep down, she knew that wasn't the case. Something had been there. From that point on, everything escalated. The nights were the worst. Her dorm room, once a sanctuary, became a prison. Every creak, every rustle of fabric set her on edge, and the whispers. They began faintly at first, like wind through the cracks of the window. But over time they grew louder, more distinct. Though she couldn't make out what they were saying, she wasn't sure she wanted to know. The demon, though she didn't yet understand it was a demon, was playing with her, slowly wearing her down. It thrived on her confusion, her fear, her growing sense of isolation. Mandy felt like she was coming undone, her mind unraveling thread by thread. She hadn't yet seen or heard anything concrete, but she knew, with a bone-deep certainty, that something was toying with her, and it was only a matter of time before it revealed itself. Here's a revised version that removes any repetitive elements from previous responses while continuing the narrative with fresh content. will slow down the build-up even more and give Mandy additional experiences before the demon fully reveals itself. Over the next few days, the strange occurrences escalated. Although Mandy hadn't seen any more handprints, the oppressive atmosphere in her room never lifted. Each time she returned from class, the air felt thicker, almost suffocating, as if the room itself were waiting for her. She found herself delaying her return to the dorm as much as possible, wandering the campus late into the evening, hoping the exhaustion would push away the fear when she finally lay down to sleep. But the exhaustion didn't help. Even when she managed to fall asleep, the dreams that followed were too vivid, too terrifying. In one, she was back in her childhood home, but the rooms were distorted impossibly long hallways that stretched into darkness, doors that led to nowhere. She walked through the house, feeling something chasing her, always just out of sight, always getting closer. She would wake up gasping for air, her chest tight, her heart pounding in terror, but the memory of what she'd seen would fade as soon as she opened her eyes. One evening, after a particularly draining day of classes, Mandy sat on her bed with her laptop, trying to focus on an assignment. She was mentally and physically exhausted, her vision blurring as she typed, her head nodding toward sleep. But just as her eyelids began to droop, there was a sudden, distinct creak. She jolted upright, her eyes darting around the room. The floorboards by her closet had creaked, but she knew she hadn't moved. The silence that followed was unbearable, a heavy quiet that pressed down on her like a weight. Mandy felt her skin prickle, every nerve on edge. For several minutes she sat frozen, staring at the closet. It was closed just as she had left it, but the feeling of being watched crept over her again, stronger than ever. Slowly she rose from the bed, her gaze never leaving the door. With a shaky breath, she stepped toward it. Her fingers grazed the doorknob, hesitant, but before she could turn it, she heard it again, the whispering. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. It wasn't coming from the closet. It was behind her. Mandy spun around, her back pressed against the closet door, her eyes scanning the room. Nothing. Just her empty dorm. She tried to tell herself she was imagining it, that the stress of school, the lack of sleep, and her own paranoia were playing tricks on her. But deep down, she knew that wasn't true. Something was here, and it was watching her. The next few nights followed the same disturbing pattern. Every evening, as the sun went down, the air in her dorm seemed to change, growing heavier, more oppressive. The shadows deepened, stretching longer across the floor, creeping toward her no matter where she stood. The whispering came more frequently now, always just outside the range of her understanding. She could never make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, mocking, almost playful, like it knew how close it was to breaking her. One night, unable to bear it any longer, Mandy left her dorm and wandered the campus for hours. She avoided the more populated areas, seeking the quiet of the gardens and empty benches scattered around the school grounds. But even there, the feeling followed her. Every gust of wind, every rustling leaf felt deliberate, as if the world itself was conspiring against her. She sat under a tree, knees pulled to her chest, staring out at the darkened campus. For a brief moment she allowed herself to cry, silent tears slipping down her cheeks. She didn't know what was happening to her, but she couldn't shake the feeling that it was only going to get worse. Back in her room, things continued to escalate. The whispers turned into distant laughter, soft and mocking, echoing through the silence. Shadows flitted just outside her vision, disappearing the moment she turned her head. Objects in her dorm began to shift ever so slightly, her textbooks, the photo frame on her desk, even her bed covers. Everything seemed off. The changes were subtle, almost imperceptible at first, but as the days went on, it became harder to ignore. Mandy tried to rationalize it, telling herself she was simply losing track of things, but deep down, she knew better. Then, one night, she woke to a cold draft sweeping through the room. Her window, which she was certain she had locked before going to bed, was open, the curtains billowing softly. Shivering, she got up to close it, her fingers trembling as she struggled with the latch. It wasn't until she turned back to her bed that she saw it, her blanket, twisted and coiled on the floor like a serpent, as though it had been thrown there. Her heart raced, and for a moment she stood frozen in the middle of the room, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. Her instinct was to leave. Run. Get out of the room and never come back. But something stopped her. A quiet voice just at the edge of her thoughts told her to stay. To confront whatever this was, taking a deep breath, Mandy picked up her blanket, slowly spreading it back over the bed. She sat on the edge, hands gripping the fabric tightly, her entire body tense. Hours passed, but nothing else happened. The whispering didn't return. The shadows remained still, but she didn't sleep. She couldn't. The next day, Mandy tried to confide in her mother, hoping for some comfort or guidance, but the words stuck in her throat, and she found herself brushing off the strange occurrences as stress-related. Her mother, of course, told her to take care of herself, to get more rest, and to not push herself too hard. It was well-meaning advice, but it did nothing to ease the growing sense of isolation and fear. How could she explain what she was going through when she could barely understand it herself? As the days dragged on, the feeling of being watched became unbearable. Mandy could feel it in every moment, even in crowded lecture halls or when walking across campus with friends. It was as if the entity followed her, lurking just behind her shoulder, waiting for the right moment to strike. She was no longer just afraid, she was consumed by it. Over the next week, the entity's presence in Mandy's life became impossible to ignore. It had grown bolder, no longer content with simple whispers or shadows at the edge of her vision. Every night, her dorm room became a battleground of her sanity. At first, it was the temperature that shifted dramatically. The cold was no longer just a draft, it was biting, an unnatural chill that seemed to seep into her bones, no matter how many blankets she wrapped herself in. The heater would be on, the room set to a normal temperature, but still, she shivered as though standing in a freezing void. Then came the sounds, louder now, more frequent. It wasn't just whispers or distant laughter anymore. Footsteps creaked on the floor when no one was there. Doors rattled, as if someone was trying to break in. Every time Mandy checked, everything seemed normal. But the moment she returned to her bed, the sounds would resume, taunting her. The footsteps sometimes circled the room, slow and deliberate, stopping just short of her bed before vanishing into silence. She could almost feel the presence looming over her, unseen, but so painfully close that it made her skin crawl. One night, Mandy woke to a strange sensation of pressure on her chest, as though someone were sitting on top of her. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Panic flooded her mind as her body remained frozen, her limbs useless against the invisible weight. It felt like fingers wrapping around her throat, tightening. Her eyes darted around the room, desperate for any sign of what was happening, but all she saw was darkness. The silence was deafening, save for the rasp of her own breath. Just as quickly as it had started, the pressure lifted, leaving her gasping and drenched in sweat. But there was no rest, no peace. Mandy began noticing changes in herself, subtle at first, but soon undeniable. She was no longer just scared, she was angry. Little things, like a dropped pen or a forgotten assignment, sent her into fits of frustration that left her trembling. She snapped at her friends for no reason, isolating herself further as she became convinced that they wouldn't understand what was happening to her. There was a weight in her chest now, a seething fury that simmered just beneath the surface. as if something inside her was feeding off her fear and growing stronger by the day. The demon's presence had become almost tangible, as though it was no longer just haunting her from the shadows but moving into her very being. It started to mock her in her own voice, echoes of her doubts and insecurities, repeated back to her in cruel tones. "You're not good enough," it would say. "You'll never succeed. Everyone knows you don't belong here." Each time it spoke, the words cut deeper, shaking her already fragile sense of self. Her mind was unraveling, and the entity knew it. It preyed on her fears, twisting them, amplifying them until she couldn't tell what was real anymore. One afternoon, while sitting in class, Mandy felt an overwhelming wave of dizziness. The world around her seemed to tilt, the faces of her classmates blurring and warping in her vision. She blinked rapidly, trying to shake off the sensation, but it only grew worse. The professor's voice became distorted, a low, droning hum that made her head throb. Her hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the desk, trying to steady herself. But then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw something, her own reflection in the window beside her. It was smiling. The smile was twisted, unnatural, far too wide, and the eyes staring back at her were not her own. Mandy jumped up, knocking her chair over as she bolted from the room. The distorted voices of her classmates faded behind her as she ran through the hallways, her heart pounding in her ears. She found herself in the restroom, locking herself in a stall, struggling to catch her breath. The image of her reflection still haunted her, the grin, the eyes, the undeniable sense that something was watching her from within. It was in that moment that she realized the demon was no longer just tormenting her from the outside. It was inside her, slipping further into her mind, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The attacks became relentless after that. Each night the demon pushed harder, invading her dreams, her thoughts, her very sense of self. She would hear its voice in her head at all hours, whispering in her ear, urging her to give in. It told her to stop fighting, to surrender, to let it take control. Her body became weaker, drained from the constant onslaught. There were days when she barely had the strength to get out of bed, her limbs heavy and unresponsive. She felt as though she was sinking, drowning in a sea of darkness, unable to claw her way back to the surface. The final night began like the others, with Mandy lying awake in bed, her heart racing and the familiar oppressive weight of the demon's presence bearing down on her. Shadows danced along the walls, swirling like phantoms in the flickering light of her desk lamp. She had tried everything to shake the feeling: the late-night prayers, the cleansing rituals suggested by online forums, the sage that only left her room smelling like burnt herbs, but nothing seemed to keep the entity at bay. Instead, it grew bolder, creeping closer to her, wrapping around her like a suffocating fog. As she lay in bed, Mandy could hear the whispers more clearly than ever, their tone shifting from mocking to sinister, like a cruel puppeteer pulling her strings. "You can't escape me," it hissed, the voice dripping with malice. "You are mine now," every syllable echoed in her mind, amplifying her dread. She clutched the blankets, twisting the fabric between her fingers until they turned white from the pressure. The room was suffocating, closing in on her, and the walls seemed to pulse with an ominous energy. The air felt thick, heavy with anticipation, as though the very fabric of reality was bending under the weight of the demon's influence. With every tick of the clock, the atmosphere became more electric. Shadows lengthened, stretching unnaturally across the walls, as if alive and writhing. The corners of the room darkened, swallowing the light and casting the space into an abyss. The whispers escalated, a cacophony of voices merging into a single, terrible chorus that echoed her deepest fears: "You're weak. You'll never escape. You don't belong here." Each word cut into her psyche like shards of glass, and Mandy squeezed her eyes shut, desperate to block them out, but it only amplified the sound in her head. Mandy's body began to tremble, not from cold, but from a primal fear that rooted her in place. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears, drowning out everything else, and she felt a pressure building in her chest, a palpable weight that made it hard to breathe. Suddenly her vision blurred and the room tilted, the world spinning around her like a whirlpool. As she gasped for air, the shadows surged forward, coiling around her like serpents, tightening their grip. She felt them constricting, squeezing the breath from her lungs, and her panic surged. The whispers were louder, more insistent. They no longer felt like they were coming from around her, they were inside her, echoing in her mind, commanding her to submit. She tried to fight, clinging to the last vestiges of her willpower, but it was slipping away, piece by piece. Her vision blurred as the room seemed to darken, shadows creeping in from all corners, coiling around her like tendrils of smoke. "Let go," Mandy the demon urged, its voice silky and smooth, a venomous caress that slithered into her mind. "You're so tired. Let me take over. I can make everything better." It felt like a twisted lullaby, soothing yet terrifying, and she fought against the tide of exhaustion pulling her under. She wanted to scream, to fight back, but her limbs felt heavy, as though they were made of lead. Each time she attempted to move, the shadows pressed harder, pinning her to the bed as if trying to keep her from escaping the inevitable. The oppressive force felt inescapable, dragging her deeper into darkness. With every breath, the weight in her chest grew heavier, suffocating her resolve. As she lay there, trembling, a sickening sense of dread enveloped her, gnawing at her insides. The whispers morphed into a single, terrifying voice, loud and deafening, echoing within the confines of her mind. "You will never escape me." It was then that the room darkened further, the shadows coalescing into a shape, a grotesque silhouette that stood at the foot of her bed. Mandy squinted against the darkness, her pulse quickening as the figure seemed to distort, shifting in and out of focus, its features just beyond her comprehension. Suddenly, a cold breeze swept through the room, extinguishing the light from her lamp, plunging her into darkness. The shadows thickened, wrapping around her like a shroud. The temperature plummeted, and she could see her breath clouding in front of her, each exhale a mist that quickly dissipated in the chilling air. In that suffocating darkness, she felt a presence looming over her, a vile energy that radiated malice. Panic surged within her as she could almost feel the demon's fingers brushing against her skin, icy and invasive, sending ripples of fear coursing through her. Desperate, she squeezed her eyes shut, clutching her blankets to her chest as if they could shield her from the horrors closing in. "Please, leave me alone," she begged, her voice trembling. "I'm not afraid of you." But deep down, she knew it was a lie. The demon knew it too, and its laughter echoed through her mind, a hollow, mocking sound that filled her with despair. "You think you're brave, Mandy? You're nothing without me." The darkness thickened around her, enveloping her completely as she felt a pressure building in her mind, a force pushing against her thoughts, seeking entry. Then, as she lay there paralyzed, the demon finally made its move. Mandy's world began to spin wildly, her consciousness flickering like a dying flame. Her body convulsed violently, the sheets tangling around her as she fought against the invisible bonds that held her down. Each seizure felt like a battle, her soul wrestling against the demon's relentless invasion. "Just give in," it whispered, its voice slithering through her defenses, promising freedom from the pain and fear. "You don't need to fight. Just surrender to me." With every ounce of will she had left, Mandy screamed, a sound torn from the depths of her being, as she felt herself teetering on the brink of losing everything. But it was no use. As the demon pushed harder, she felt her mind fracturing, the shadows seeping deeper into her essence. The moment stretched, an eternity of darkness where she was left with only her fear and the entity consuming her. Just as she felt her consciousness slipping away, the demon seized its opportunity. An agonizing pain shot through her body, a dark power invading her, clawing its way into her very soul. Mandy's body jerked violently, her back arching off the bed as an inhuman scream ripped from her throat. Her limbs flailed, as though some invisible force was controlling her. She could feel it, something dark, something ancient, crawling through her veins, overtaking her. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was pure, unbridled terror, the kind that reached down to her very soul. Her mind fractured under the pressure, her thoughts splintering into 1,000 incoherent fragments. She wanted to scream, to call out for help, but her voice was gone, swallowed by the darkness. Her body convulsed again, each violent spasm bringing her closer to the edge of something terrible, something she couldn't fully comprehend. The demon was inside her now, and there was no turning back. Mandy's consciousness began to fade. The last thing she heard before everything went black was the demon's laughter, low and triumphant. Her last thought was a desperate plea for help, swallowed by the darkness as the demon fully took control. In the days following Mandy's possession, a heavy shroud of unease enveloped her, cloaking her true self beneath layers of darkness. To the casual observer, she seemed unchanged, but beneath the surface, an insidious transformation was taking place. The demon's presence clung to her like a shadow, suffocating her spirit and preying on her vulnerabilities. With each passing day, she walked the campus with a leaden heart, her once bright eyes now dimmed and clouded, resembling lifeless orbs that had lost their spark. The laughter that used to spill from her lips faded into echoes, replaced by a haunting silence that deepened the chasm between her and her friends, like an invisible barrier no one could breach. At first, her friends noticed the subtle shifts in her demeanor, a missed text here, a forgotten study session there. Mandy appeared distant, her mind often wandering to places just beyond reach, as if she were chasing shadows. Sarah, her closest friend, felt the weight of concern settle over her like a heavy fog when Mandy canceled their coffee date at the last minute. "You've been saying that a lot lately," Sarah remarked, her brow furrowing in worry. "Are you sure you're okay?" Mandy attempted to brush off the concern with a half-hearted smile, yet the gesture lacked its usual warmth. Her eyes flickered momentarily, revealing an unsettling darkness that sent shivers coursing through Sarah. In that moment, it was as if Mandy were a puppet controlled by invisible strings, her smile stretched too wide and lingering a heartbeat too long, igniting a primal instinct in Sarah to flee from the ominous undercurrents swirling around her friend. As the days stretched on, the changes in Mandy grew more pronounced, her descent into darkness becoming increasingly evident. In class, she resembled a specter, her once enthusiastic participation replaced by a suffocating silence. She occupied her usual seat, yet her fingers tapped anxiously against the desk, a staccato rhythm that echoed the erratic beats of her heart. Her vibrant sketches morphed into dark, twisted representations, depicting landscapes overshadowed by lurking shadows and ominous figures, each stroke resonating with the dread that now permeated her being. During group discussions, her laughter transformed into an unsettling cackle, devoid of joy and imbued with an eerie quality that sent chills racing down her friends' spines. "Maybe we should just abandon the project altogether," she suggested one day, her tone laced with a sinister sarcasm that sent shock waves through her companions. The twisted grin that accompanied her words sent shivers down their spines as they exchanged concerned glances, feeling an instinctive weariness toward the girl they once knew. Late at night, when her roommates were tucked away in their dreams, Mandy would wander the dimly lit halls of their apartment, her bare feet gliding silently across the cold wooden floor. In those still hours, she'd whisper to herself in a voice that felt foreign, melodic yet chilling, as if engaged in a conversation with a companion no one else could see. Her words, a blend of gibberish and haunting lullabies, drifted through the air, wrapping around her like an eerie melody that reverberated in the stillness. The atmosphere grew thick with tension, a palpable weight that suffocated her roommates, wrapping around them like a ghostly shroud. They would stir in their sleep, feeling the chill creep into their bones, the sense of foreboding gnawing at their hearts. Should we check on her? One would whisper, their voice barely audible over the oppressive silence, but the question hung unanswered in the air, swallowed by the dark shadows pooling around Mandy's room. One evening, Sarah could no longer ignore her instinctual worry and decided to confront Mandy. "Can we talk? You've been acting strange lately," she said, her voice wavering slightly as she observed Mandy absently braiding her hair, fingers moving with a mechanical precision that felt unsettling. Mandy's smile returned, yet it was unnaturally wide, stretching across her face in a way that felt grotesque, the corners of her lips curling up too far. "Strange? I'm just fine," she replied, her laughter ringing with a hollow, unsettling echo, the sound skimming the surface of reality like a pebble cast across a still pond. Yet in that moment, her eyes darkened, a flicker of something malevolent flashing through. And Sarah felt an instinctive chill course through her. "Are you sure?" "It's okay if you're going through something," she pressed gently, desperate to reach the friend she had known. But Mandy's demeanor shifted abruptly, her voice dropping to a chilling whisper that resonated in the still air. "You should be careful what you wish for," she warned. Her smile stretching wider, and the sound sent icy dread flooding through Sarah's veins, a visceral realization that something was terribly wrong. As the days wore on, the dark energy surrounding Mandy intensified, coiling tighter around her like a serpent preparing to strike. She began isolating herself further from her friends, retreating deeper into the shadows of her room, where the entity whispered sweet nothings, drawing her deeper into its malevolent embrace. The other students in her classes started to sense this shift in her energy, a heavy cloud hovering just above her, suffocating any light she had once possessed. Whispers circulated in hushed tones. "Is Mandy okay? She seems off." Sarah grew increasingly worried, often attempting to reach out, only to be met with a chilling silence and an uncharacteristic coldness that enveloped Mandy. The laughter that once rang through their dormitory became a distant memory, replaced by an oppressive tension that blanketed the space. And late at night, Sarah could hear Mandy speaking in low tones, her voice rising and falling in a strange rhythm, as if chanting a lullaby for the shadows that crept ever closer. Mandy's mood swings became more pronounced. One moment, she would burst into fits of laughter, seemingly sharing a joke with the unseen forces that tormented her, and the next she would stare into the void, her face contorted in a grimace of despair. Friends began to comment on her increasingly unsettling behavior, exchanging worried glances during group activities. "You look exhausted, Mandy. Are you sleeping?" They would ask, but her responses were vague, shrouded in cryptic references that hinted at something deeper lurking beneath her surface. "I'm just fine," she'd insist, her smile devoid of warmth, yet the laughter that followed echoed like distant thunder, dark and foreboding, leaving her friends feeling as though they were peering into a storm they couldn't escape. The familiar spark of friendship began to dim, replaced by a tense silence that threatened to consume them all. As the days dragged on, Mandy's physical appearance began to mirror her internal torment, transforming her into a ghostly reflection of the vibrant girl she once was. She lost weight rapidly, her cheeks hollowing out, giving her an ethereal, gaunt look that made her seem almost otherworldly. Her skin turned pale and drawn, as if the very essence of her being was being siphoned away, the rosy glow of youth replaced by an ashen hue that spoke of sleepless nights and silent battles. Her once glorious hair dulled, transforming into a limp shadow of its former self, hanging around her shoulders like a funeral shroud. Friends would gaze at her in concern, the unease growing palpable as they struggled to find the right words. "You look terrible, Mandy. Are you eating enough?" they would probe, their voices tinged with worry. But Mandy's responses were unsettlingly vague, laced with a mockery that was new and foreign. "I'm just fine," she'd reply, her laughter echoing ominously in the stillness, leaving her friends feeling like they were standing on the precipice of an unfathomable abyss. It all came to a head one fateful night, when Mandy invited Sarah over for a movie night, a desperate attempt to recreate the normalcy that had slipped through their fingers like sand. Yet the air was thick with an unnatural tension, an oppressive weight that hung heavily in the dimly lit room, wrapping around them like an unwelcome embrace. As the film played, Mandy sat rigidly on the couch, her body still yet her eyes darting restlessly, glued to the screen but failing to truly see it. Sarah, sensing the palpable unease, stole glances at Mandy, her heart racing as she caught sight of her friend's reflection in the darkened TV screen. For a split second, she glimpsed something else staring back at her, a visage twisted in pain, a smile that didn't belong to Mandy, a grotesque parody of the girl she once knew. Heart racing, she turned back to face Mandy, only to find her expression transformed, her gaze vacant and hollow, as though she were trapped in a nightmare from which she could not escape. "What's happening to you, Mandy?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling with fear, dread pooling in her stomach like a heavy stone. But Mandy merely smiled, a sinister grin that sent icy dread flooding through Sarah. "You'll find out soon enough." The room felt like it was closing in, the shadows growing longer and darker, as if they were alive, wrapping around them, whispering secrets that no one should ever know. The night stretched on, the air thick with unspoken fears, and as the credits rolled, Mandy's laughter echoed, resonating through the silence, a sound both familiar and utterly foreign, a harbinger of the horrors that lay ahead. Mandy's friends had been whispering among themselves for days now, exchanging worried glances whenever she wasn't looking. It started with the little things, her forgetting important assignments, showing up late to meetups, or canceling plans altogether. Each time someone asked her if everything was okay, she brushed it off with a weak smile and a casual excuse, blaming stress from exams or lack of sleep. But the excuses were wearing thin. It wasn't like Mandy to be so scattered, and the exhaustion in her eyes seemed more than just a product of late-night study sessions. The closer her friends looked, the more they realized this was a different kind of tiredness, one that settled deep into her bones. A few days later, Claire, her roommate, noticed something peculiar. Mandy hadn't spoken to her much that week, staying mostly in her room. But Claire could swear she heard her talking late at night. The walls of the dorm were thin, and she was used to hearing muffled sounds from both sides. Yet this time felt different. The low murmurs coming from Mandy's room were unsettling, as though she wasn't alone. Claire had a sinking feeling in her stomach. She debated knocking on Mandy's door but decided against it, hoping it was just another late-night phone call. Still, the unease lingered, wrapping around her thoughts like an unwanted shadow. At lunch, the tension among the group reached a peak. Mandy sat with them but seemed distant, poking at her food without eating much. When Claire asked about her late-night conversations, Mandy's response was oddly defensive. "I don't know what you're talking about," she snapped, her voice sharper than intended. The others exchanged uncomfortable looks. It wasn't like Mandy to lash out, and they worried about what was brewing beneath the surface. "Maybe you should try to get some rest," Claire suggested gently, trying to bridge the growing gap. Mandy didn't reply, staring down at her plate, her expression lost and almost hollow. After that lunch, things only got stranger. One evening, Jess, another close friend, visited Mandy's dorm, hoping to check on her. When Mandy didn't answer the door, Jess used the spare key Claire had given her. As she stepped inside, a chill ran down her spine. The room was dim, curtains drawn tightly against the outside world. She found Mandy sitting in the dark, staring blankly at the wall, as if in a trance. "Mandy, are you okay?" Jess asked, her voice trembling. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, as Mandy turned slowly to face her, eyes wide and unseeing. "I'm fine," she whispered, but there was something unsettling in her tone, something that made Jess's skin crawl. Without waiting for a response, Jess quickly excused herself, her heart racing as she left the room. That night, Jess and Claire had a long conversation. "Something's wrong with her," Jess insisted, her voice low. "She's not acting like herself at all," Claire agreed, sharing the strange encounter she had experienced in their dorm. They both knew Mandy was under a lot of pressure, but this felt different, almost ominous. "Maybe we should talk to her parents," Jess suggested hesitantly. "I don't know, it feels like we're overreacting," Claire replied, though doubt crept into her voice. "But what if we're not?" Jess pushed. They agreed to give it a few more days, hoping Mandy would open up on her own, but in their hearts, they both knew it was a dangerous gamble. As the week dragged on, things escalated. Mandy's absence from classes became more frequent. When she did show up, she barely interacted with anyone. One professor even pulled Claire aside after class, concern etched across his face. "Is Mandy all right?" he asked delicately. "I'm worried she might be going through something serious," Claire assured him that they were handling it, but inside her worry grew. The stress of their studies was already heavy, and now this added weight felt almost unbearable. She knew they couldn't ignore it much longer. Something had to give. The breaking point came when Mandy missed an important group project meeting entirely. She didn't text, didn't call, and when Claire tried to reach her, her phone went straight to voicemail. "This is getting ridiculous," Jess muttered, pacing the common area. "We can't just keep pretending everything's normal," Claire agreed. They both knew it was time to do something, but confronting Mandy directly felt like stepping into dangerous territory. The tension between wanting to help and the fear of what they might uncover loomed over them, dark and threatening. They couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the brink of something far worse than just a few missed classes. That night, Claire mustered the courage to knock on Mandy's door, determined to get some answers. When Mandy finally opened it, Claire was taken aback by her appearance. Dark circles under her eyes, her hair unkempt, and her clothes rumpled like she hadn't changed in days. "We need to talk," Claire said, her voice firmer than usual, trying to mask the worry that was threatening to spill over. Mandy just stared at her for a moment, then stepped aside, letting Claire into the dimly lit room. The air inside felt thick, almost suffocating, a stark contrast to the bright daylight outside. "What's going on with you?" Claire asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Mandy didn't answer right away. She sat on the edge of her bed, looking down at her hands. "I don't know," she finally whispered. "I don't feel right." The conversation didn't go much further. Mandy gave vague responses, insisting she was fine, just tired, but Claire could see through the facade. The unease settled in her stomach like a heavy stone. She wasn't fine. Something deeper was going on, something Mandy either couldn't or wouldn't explain. As Claire left the room that night, she knew they couldn't wait any longer. They had to involve her family. The worry clung to her, gnawing at her thoughts. Mandy's life was unraveling, and if they didn't intervene soon, she might slip through their fingers entirely. The following week, Mandy attended a campus party, hoping to escape the oppressive cloud of worry that hung over her. Claire and Jess were skeptical but decided to go along, hoping the lively atmosphere might pull Mandy out of her dark spiral. However, the party was a mixed blessing. As soon as they arrived, Mandy seemed off kilter, her laughter a little too forced, her smile too wide. It was evident to Claire and Jess that she wasn't enjoying herself, rather, she was just going through the motions, trapped in a performance that left her hollow. As the night wore on, the atmosphere grew more chaotic. Music thumped loudly, bodies swayed, and laughter filled the air, but Mandy remained distant. She spent most of the evening standing alone in a corner, her gaze fixed on a shadowy corner of the room. Claire noticed her staring at something, or rather someone, but when she followed Mandy's line of sight, she found nothing there, just a flickering light bulb casting eerie shadows across the wall. Claire felt a chill run down her spine, and her concern deepened. "Mandy, are you all right?" she asked, approaching her friend, but Mandy barely acknowledged her presence, lost in whatever dark thoughts haunted her. Just then, the energy in the room shifted. A loud crash erupted as a group of party-goers stumbled into a table, sending drinks flying. Claire turned her head, distracted by the commotion, but when she glanced back at Mandy, she gasped. Mandy's expression had transformed into something unrecognizable. Her smile was gone, replaced by an unsettling stare that seemed to pierce through the chaos. It was as if she had slipped into another world entirely, a place where the noise and laughter faded into a haunting silence. Claire's heart raced as she reached out to touch Mandy's shoulder, but Mandy jerked away, her eyes wide and unfocused. "Mandy," Jess called out, rushing over, concern etched on her face. But Mandy's gaze remained locked on that same shadowy corner, and the intensity in her eyes was frightening. "You need to snap out of it," Jess urged, her voice rising above the din of the party. In that moment, Mandy suddenly turned to them, her demeanor shifting in an instant. A dark shadow seemed to flicker across her face, her expression twisting into something malevolent. "Why are you here?" she hissed, her voice dropping to a low growl that sent shivers through Jess and Claire. The laughter and music around them faded away, leaving only the chilling sound of Mandy's words. The crowd began to notice, whispers spreading like wildfire as more eyes turned toward the trio. "Is she okay?" someone asked, while others recorded the incident on their phones. Claire and Jess exchanged horrified glances, realizing that this was more than just a bad night for their friend. As they tried to reason with Mandy, her behavior became increasingly erratic. She swayed on her feet, her voice alternating between sweet and venomous, mocking her friends in a way that felt entirely unnatural. "You think you can help me?" she sneered, her words laced with disdain, sending a wave of panic through Claire and Jess. Feeling overwhelmed, Jess decided to act. "We need to get her out of here," she whispered urgently to Claire, but as they turned to grab Mandy's arms, she recoiled violently, knocking over a drink that spilled across the floor. "Get away from me," Mandy screamed, her voice echoing through the party. A hush fell over the crowd as they watched in disbelief. The party atmosphere shifted from one of revelry to an intense focus on the unfolding drama. People moved back, creating a wide circle around them, phones still recording, capturing every moment of Mandy's unraveling. Desperate and frightened, Claire took a step closer, trying to reach her friend. "Mandy, please, you're scaring us," but Mandy's expression hardened, and she tilted her head as if listening to a voice only she could hear. "You think you know me? You know nothing," she spat, her eyes narrowing with a mixture of rage and sorrow. The crowd shifted uneasily, some whispering that they should call for help. And in that moment, Mandy let out a piercing shriek, a sound that seemed to echo from somewhere deep within her. Claire felt her heart drop. This wasn't just a bad night, it felt like a warning sign, a harbinger of something dark closing in. Amidst the chaos, someone finally called for a campus security officer, their voice breaking through the murmur of the crowd. Jess and Claire exchanged worried glances as they realized the gravity of the situation. They could no longer pretend everything was okay. They needed to act quickly before it spiraled out of control. When the officer arrived, he assessed the scene, eyes widening at Mandy's wild demeanor. "Miss, you need to calm down," he said firmly, but his words only seemed to provoke her further. Mandy responded with another scream, louder and more primal, and the officer stepped back, clearly taken aback. Claire, heart pounding, rushed to Mandy's side, whispering softly, "We're here for you, Mandy. We're not going to let you go through this alone." But even as she spoke, a part of her felt the chill of fear, realizing that the entity haunting her friend was growing stronger. Just then, a memory surfaced, a warning she had overheard during a late-night study session, a conversation about how some darkness feeds on fear and anxiety. The thought made her stomach twist in knots as she tried to reach out to Mandy, desperate to pull her back from the edge. As the officer called for backup, Jess pulled out her phone, ready to contact Mandy's family. "I think we need to get her home," she said urgently. "They need to know what's happening. She can't do this alone." Claire nodded, tears brimming in her eyes as she watched her friend unravel before them. They had tried to help, but it was clear now that the darkness surrounding Mandy was far more potent than they had realized. It was time for a different kind of intervention, one that they hoped could pull Mandy back from the brink. The security guard's voice crackled over the radio, "I need backup. There's a situation here." His eyes remained fixed on Mandy, who stood with a manic gleam in her eyes, her laughter echoing unnaturally in the night air. A pair of officers soon arrived, their flashlights cutting through the darkness, illuminating the chaos unfolding. "What's going on here?" one of the officers asked, glancing between the guard and Mandy, whose posture had shifted from playful to confrontational in an instant. Mandy's laughter faded into an unsettling silence as she turned her gaze toward the newcomers, a predator sizing up her prey. "You think you can stop me?" she challenged, the words dripping with a confidence that felt eerie against the backdrop of the flickering lights. The officers exchanged concerned glances, sensing something was deeply amiss. "I am. You need to come with us," one of them said cautiously, his voice steady but laced with authority. But Mandy shook her head, a twisted smile spreading across her lips. As the tension escalated, the first guard took a step closer, trying to reach out to her. "You're not in trouble, Mandy. We just want to help you." But the more he spoke, the more her demeanor shifted. "Help? Is that what you call it?" she spat, her voice rising. "You don't understand the power I have now. You can't take that from me." The words hung heavy in the air, sending shivers down the spines of those present. Mandy suddenly turned on her heel and sprinted away from them, her laughter trailing behind like a haunting melody. "Mandy!" wait, Claire shouted, her heart racing as she chased after her. Jess followed close behind, fear propelling her forward. They watched helplessly as Mandy dashed through the shadows, her figure darting in and out of the pools of light cast by the security lamps. "Mandy, please," Claire yelled, desperation creeping into her voice as they pursued her through the winding paths of the campus. "We're your friends. You don't have to do this alone." But Mandy only laughed louder, a sound that was becoming increasingly unsettling as it echoed through the night. The officers called for backup again, their radios crackling with urgency, adding to the chaos of the scene. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of chasing, the girls cornered Mandy in a deserted courtyard. She stood there, chest heaving, eyes wild with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. "You don't understand. I'm not the one you should be afraid of," she shouted, her voice echoing off the stone walls. Claire and Jess exchanged terrified glances, realizing that something had fundamentally changed in their friend. "Mandy, please, just come back with us," Jess pleaded, reaching out to her. But Mandy stepped back, a flicker of something darker crossing her features. "You think you can save me? You don't even know what's coming." Just then, The sound of approaching footsteps resonated from the path they had come from, the backup security arriving in a flurry of flashlights and voices. The atmosphere turned electric, charged with a fear that felt almost palpable. "Mandy, we can talk about this," Claire tried again, her heart pounding in her chest. But Mandy just shook her head, her laughter returning, more manic and wild than ever. "It's too late for that. They're here for me now." She turned to face the guards, her stance defiantly challenging. The tension in the air thickened, and Claire could feel a chill crawling up her spine as Mandy's eyes darkened, reflecting something unnatural. In that moment, everything erupted. The guards stepped forward, trying to restrain Mandy, but she broke free, her movements swift and unnaturally agile. "Get away from me," she screamed, pushing one of them back with a force that surprised everyone. Panic ensued as the officers attempted to regain control, but Mandy's laughter mingled with the chaos, an echo of something twisted lurking beneath the surface. As her friends watched in horror, the guard struggled to maintain his grip, but Mandy was slipping away, her voice growing louder, almost a chant as she began to move erratically. The night air was thick with an unnameable dread as Claire and Jess stood frozen, fear mingling with helplessness. "We need to call her family," Claire shouted to Jess, urgency pressing against her chest. The officers finally managed to subdue Mandy, but as they did, the air seemed to pulse with a dark energy, and Claire knew that whatever was happening to her friend was far beyond their understanding. The officers managed to restrain Mandy after what felt like an eternity of resistance. She was finally subdued, her body sagging in defeat as they pulled her hands behind her back. Her breath came in ragged gasps, a mixture of anger and confusion. As they led her away, the whispers of students filled the air, their curiosity morphing into concern as they witnessed the chaos unfold. The campus, once vibrant and alive with laughter, now felt heavy with dread, as if the spirit of the night had been stolen. Mandy was taken to a private room for her safety while campus security assessed the situation. After what felt like hours, she was finally released. The officers explained that she was being suspended from school for her safety and the safety of others. The words fell on her like a lead blanket, dragging her deeper into despair. As she stepped out into the cool night air, the reality of her situation settled in, a gnawing ache of humiliation and fear. Her friends, Claire and Jess, rushed to her side, concern etched on their faces. "Are you okay?" Jess asked, her voice trembling slightly. But Mandy only nodded, unable to find the words to articulate the chaos swirling in her mind. With her friends at her side, she trudged back to the dorm, her footsteps heavy and slow, as if the weight of her reality was dragging her down. Once they reached her room, she quickly shut the door behind her, the sound echoing in the hollow silence. Once inside, Mandy leaned against the door, taking deep breaths as her heart raced. The room felt stifling, the walls closing in on her. She could hear Claire and Jess softly talking outside, but she was in no state to face them. They didn't understand, not yet. Her mind was a jumbled mess, grappling with the overwhelming emotions that clawed at her insides. She wanted to scream, to cry, but instead she sank to the floor, locking herself in her own sanctuary of despair. As the hours slipped away, the darkness of her room enveloped her like a heavy shroud. She tried to sleep, but restless thoughts kept her tossing and turning. The faces of her friends, the chaos at the party, and the officers' concerned gazes replayed in her mind. Each time she closed her eyes, the events looped like a broken record, and the sense of unease that had settled in her gut refused to let go. She felt like a stranger in her own body, lost in a world that had suddenly turned hostile. Claire and Jess remained outside her door, occasionally knocking and calling her name, but their voices felt muffled, distant. "Mandy, please come out," Jess pleaded, worry creeping into her tone. We're here for you." But the reassurance felt foreign to her. She didn't want to face them, didn't want them to see the darkness that had crept into her mind. Hours turned into a blur, and she felt herself sinking deeper into the shadows that whispered her name, wrapping around her like a suffocating fog. Finally, the next morning, Claire took it upon herself to call Mandy's parents. The conversation was fraught with tension as she tried to explain the situation without sounding overly dramatic. "Mandy had a rough night," Claire began, her voice shaky. "She got into a bit of trouble at the party, and now she's suspended. We think it would be best if you could come and get her." Mandy's parents, initially shocked, quickly shifted into concern. "We'll come as soon as we can," her mother said, urgency lacing her tone. But they lived several hours away, and the reality of their travel time hung heavily in the air. Claire could sense the gravity of the situation settling like a thick fog over the conversation, and she felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on her shoulders. As days passed, the atmosphere in the dorm grew tense. Classes continued, but Mandy's absence was felt acutely. The vibrant energy of campus life felt distant, and whispers about her situation circulated among students, their gazes lingering on her empty seat in class. Claire and Jess spent their time keeping vigil outside Mandy's door, anxiety mounting with each passing hour. They exchanged worried glances, desperate to hear any sign of their friend on the other side. Finally, on the third day, Mandy's family arrived. Claire and Jess were waiting outside the dorm, their hearts pounding with anticipation. Her father, a tall figure with a stern demeanor, led the way, followed closely by Mandy's mother, whose eyes were wide with concern. The sight of them brought a flicker of hope to Claire's heart, but it was quickly overshadowed by the anxiety of what they would discover inside. "Mandy," her mother cried, rushing toward her room, her voice filled with desperation. Claire stepped forward to guide them toward the door, her pulse racing. "We need to talk to her first," her father said, his tone firm yet worried. "We need to understand what's happening." He knocked gently on the door, but it remained silent, and dread pooled in the pit of Claire's stomach as they stood in uncertainty, unsure of what awaited them inside. As Mandy stood in the dim light of her dorm room, her heart raced at the sound of her mother's voice outside the door. The warmth of familiarity felt foreign now, as though she had slipped into another world. She hesitated, her mind a storm of confusion, before finally twisting the doorknob. The moment she opened the door, her mother rushed in, wrapping her in a tight embrace, her body radiating warmth. But as Mandy stood there, she felt a chilling emptiness inside her, like a void waiting to swallow her whole. "Mandy, we were so worried," her mother exclaimed, pulling back to examine her daughter's face. Mandy forced a smile, but the corners of her mouth barely moved, and her eyes felt hollow. Her father stood behind her mother, arms crossed, scrutinizing her as if trying to peel back the layers of darkness that surrounded her. The tension was palpable, and Mandy could feel their unspoken fears swirling around them, tightening like a noose around her throat. She ached to reassure them, but the words felt trapped, tangled in a web of shadows. "What happened? Why did you get into trouble at school?" her father asked, his tone heavy with concern. The question struck her like a bolt of lightning. Memories from the night before flashed in her mind, the chaos, the anger bubbling to the surface like a festering wound. She opened her mouth to respond, but all that escaped was a frustrated exhale. Instead, she shrugged, the movement feeling robotic, as though she were merely a puppet controlled by unseen strings. Her father's brow furrowed, disappointment etched on his face, as if he was witnessing the unraveling of everything he believed in. "Mandy, please," her mother urged, her voice soft yet insistent. "We need to understand. Your friends are scared." Mandy felt an inexplicable surge of anger at the mention of her friends, a flame flickering in her chest. "They didn't know the truth," didn't see the shadows that danced around her when she was alone. She felt isolated in her torment, trapped within her own skin. "I just needed some space," she finally said, her voice strained as the darkness within her whispered its approval. Claire and Jess lingered at the door, exchanging worried glances as they caught the atmosphere shifting. The tightness in Mandy's chest grew as she felt their eyes on her, judging, evaluating. It made her skin crawl. Her father took a step closer, concern giving way to frustration. "This isn't normal, Mandy. You need to talk to us. You can't keep shutting us out." The words felt like a chainsaw carving through her fragile sanity. She wanted to scream, to lash out, but the rage bubbling inside her simmered just beneath the surface. "I'm fine," she shot back, her voice rising in pitch. It was a lie, one she wished she could believe. But even as she shouted, she could hear the tremor of uncertainty in her tone. The laughter that had once come easily now felt like an alien language. "No, you're not," her father replied sharply, the sting of his words sending another wave of heat through her. "This is more than just needing space. You're not yourself, Mandy." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of her own rapid breathing. "Maybe she's doing drugs," her father suggested, the words spilling out like poison. They settled in the room, thick and heavy, clinging to her like a shroud. Mandy recoiled, her stomach twisting into knots. "I'm not doing drugs," she snapped, the words sounding hollow even as she fought to reclaim her voice. But her father's gaze remained fixed, unwavering, filled with a mix of concern and disbelief. "I saw how you acted at that party," he continued, his voice steady but stern. "It's not just stress, Mandy. You need to be honest with us." The shadows in her mind danced and shifted, a twisted symphony that played only for her. She felt the suffocating weight of their expectations, the pressure mounting as she grappled with her own reality. "You don't understand," she managed, her voice trembling. The words felt inadequate, impotent against the growing darkness inside her. "Something's wrong, and we can't ignore it," her mother interjected, reaching for her hands. The warmth of her mother's touch felt like fire against her icy skin, but it did little to quell the chaos raging within. "We need to take you home. Maybe a change of scenery will help." The thought of leaving felt both liberating and terrifying. Could she escape the shadows, if only for a moment? "Fine," she whispered, defeated, her heart heavy with dread. As they gathered her things, the tension in the air crackled, and Mandy felt a strange sense of detachment. She watched her family moving around her like they were characters in a dream, their words distant echoes in her mind. They couldn't see what she was seeing, the dark tendrils creeping closer, brushing against her skin. "We're doing this for you," her father said, his voice laden with conviction. "You need help." But as they prepared to leave, a cold laugh echoed in her mind, a reminder that whatever was haunting her wasn't done yet. Stepping out into the world felt like stepping into a nightmare. The brightness of the day seemed too harsh, too real, contrasting sharply with the darkness inside her. Mandy locked eyes with Claire and Jess, who stood watching her with a mixture of concern and pity. "We'll be okay," Mandy, Claire reassured, but the words fell flat against the weight pressing down on her chest. "Just get better, okay," Jess added, but it felt like a prayer whispered into a void. As they drove away, Mandy sat in silence, staring out the window, her thoughts racing. She felt like a passenger in her own life, drifting further away from the person she used to be. Shadows flitted at the edges of her vision, and the sense of foreboding swelled inside her. Her parents exchanged worried glances, their silence speaking volumes. The storm was far from over, it was only just beginning, and the darkness was hungry for her. As Mandy entered her childhood home, the familiar scents of lavender and freshly baked cookies enveloped her, triggering a whirlwind of memories that felt both comforting and alien. Her parents greeted her with cautious smiles, their relief palpable yet shadowed by the undercurrent of worry that lingered in the air. The warmth of the living room contrasted sharply with the chill that crept along her spine. It was a stark reminder that something inside her had irrevocably changed, even if she couldn't quite articulate it. The laughter of her younger siblings echoed from the kitchen, a sound that had once brought her joy but now felt like a distant dream. In the following days, Mandy settled into a routine that felt increasingly suffocating. Each morning she awoke to the haunting quiet of her room, where the shadows seemed to stretch and twist beyond the bounds of reason. She spent hours staring at the ceiling, her thoughts swirling like dark clouds, pressing down on her until breathing felt like an effort. Whenever her mother knocked on her door, concern laced her voice, but Mandy would only mumble vague reassurances, the words sticking in her throat like shards of glass. "I'm just tired," she would say, her tone flat, as if rehearsing a script she no longer believed. At the dinner table, the atmosphere was strained. Her parents exchanged worried glances as they watched her poke at her food, the knife and fork feeling foreign in her hands. "Mandy, you used to love your mother's lasagna," her father remarked, trying to break the heavy silence. But she merely shrugged, the taste of the food like sawdust in her mouth. Instead, her gaze drifted to the corner of the room, where shadows pooled, darkening the vibrant colors of the wallpaper. She could almost see something writhing there, whispering secrets that clawed at her sanity. As the days passed, her parents grew increasingly concerned. They tried to coax her into conversations to draw her back into the light, but each interaction felt like pushing against a brick wall. Mandy would often stare blankly at the TV, her eyes glazed over as images flickered in front of her. At times she felt like an observer in her own life, watching from a distance as her family moved around her, their voices blending into a dull hum that barely registered in her mind. Whenever her siblings would approach her, seeking the sister they once knew, she would merely smile a smile that felt more like a mask than an expression of genuine warmth. At night, the shadows became her only companions. They seemed to come alive, reaching out with long, tendril-like fingers that curled around her mind, drawing her deeper into their embrace. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices that echoed her insecurities, amplifying the darkness within her. "You're worthless," they hissed, words laced with venom that made her skin crawl. "You'll never be good enough." Each night, she would lie in bed, gripping the sheets tightly, feeling as though the darkness was trying to pull her into its depths. Sleep eluded her, replaced by nightmares that felt disturbingly real, visions of her friends, her family, their faces twisted in fear and disgust. When she ventured outside, the world felt different. The sun seemed too bright, the colors too vivid, as if everything was trying to blind her to the encroaching darkness. The neighborhood children played in the park, laughter ringing out like a distant melody, but for Mandy it felt like a cruel joke. She would watch them from the window, her heart heavy with longing, yet the shadows behind her whispered that she was beyond saving, that she belonged to them now. It was a gnawing realization that sank deep into her bones, a feeling of inevitability that made her shiver, despite the warmth of the sunlight streaming in. Her interactions with her family grew strained. "Are you feeling okay?" her mother would ask, her voice edged with concern. But Mandy would just smile, a hollow gesture that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm fine," she would insist, the words dripping with falsehood. Inside, a storm raged, and she felt herself slipping further away from the people she loved. It was as if an invisible barrier separated them, one that she couldn't quite breach, no matter how hard she tried. Each day she wore a facade of normalcy, but underneath, she was fraying at the edges, unraveling slowly like an old tapestry. In quiet moments, she would find herself speaking to the shadows, not out of any conscious decision but as a response to the whispers that taunted her relentlessly. "You're not alone," they would coo, their voices smooth as silk but sharp as knives. "You're special." They'll never understand. Each conversation felt like a seduction, drawing her deeper into a web of darkness she didn't know how to escape. The more she engaged, the less she felt like herself. Her identity began to twist, reshaped by the influence of something far more sinister than she could comprehend. One evening, as her family gathered in the living room, Mandy retreated to her room, feeling the weight of their stares on her back. She locked the door behind her, the click of the latch sounding like a finality she couldn't escape. Alone, she pressed her ear against the cool wood, listening to their muffled voices. They were worried, she could hear it in their tones, and yet their concern felt like a noose tightening around her neck. "What's happening to her?" Her mother's voice trembled, filled with a mixture of love and fear that seeped through the cracks of her heart. In her sanctuary, the shadows coiled tighter, their whispers becoming a seductive melody that promised relief from the pain of reality. "Let go," they urged, coaxing her deeper into their fold. "They don't know you. They'll only hurt you." Mandy gripped her hair, tugging at the roots as she fought against the seductive pull. Yet, with every passing day, she found it harder to resist. The darkness became her comfort, a cold embrace that enveloped her whenever she felt overwhelmed. As her family remained in the dark, oblivious to the horrors unraveling inside her, Mandy began to lose track of time. Days blurred into one another, and the walls of her room felt like they were closing in. In moments of clarity, she would catch glimpses of her reflection in the mirror, only to recoil at the hollow-eyed stranger staring back at her. "Help me," she whispered into the void, but the shadows laughed, a cruel sound that echoed in her mind, dismissing her plea as a sign of weakness. Each day became a battle against the dark tide rising within her. The once comforting hum of family life became a cacophony of dread, their voices grating against her frayed nerves. She would sit in silence, her fingers drumming on the armrest of the couch as they watched TV, a pressure building in her chest that made it hard to breathe. It was as if she were drowning in a sea of expectations and fears, and the more she tried to stay afloat, the deeper she sank. The sense of impending doom grew stronger with each passing hour. Mandy's parents remained blissfully unaware, caught in their own worries and attempts to help her. As they moved about the house, laughter and conversation filled the air, but for Mandy, it was nothing but an alien sound, a reminder of the life she once had, now forever out of reach. Shadows danced at the corners of her vision, taunting her, reminding her that the deeper she fell into darkness, the more she would lose everything she once held dear. As days turned into a blur, Mandy's family could no longer ignore the sinister changes unfolding within her. They had hoped she would bounce back, that the comfort of home would rejuvenate her spirit, but instead it seemed to exacerbate her condition. With her eyes sunken and her laughter silenced, her parents exchanged worried glances, each one a silent acknowledgement of their daughter's distress. It was a fleeting conversation over breakfast that solidified their decision. Her mother, with trembling hands, finally spoke what they had both been avoiding. "We need to take her to see a doctor. This isn't just teenage angst anymore." The following day, they made the appointment. The drive to the clinic felt suffocating, the air thick with unspoken fears and concerns. Mandy sat in the back seat, staring out the window at the passing trees, their vibrant green, now tinged with a shadow that seemed to follow her. Her father glanced at her through the rearview mirror, attempting to gauge her mood, but found only a distant stare, her face pale and drawn. "You'll feel better after talking to someone," he said gently, but Mandy offered no reply, lost in the tempest brewing within her. Arriving at the clinic, the sterile smell of antiseptic mixed with the faint scent of floral air freshener created an unsettling atmosphere. They entered the waiting room, where the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glare on the patients seated quietly, each one lost in their own world of concerns. Mandy felt a wave of nausea wash over her, the light feeling too bright, the sounds of muted conversations echoing strangely in her ears. Her parents filled out forms, their brows furrowed with worry, but Mandy couldn't focus on the papers before her, the words swimming like a mirage in her mind. Once inside the doctor's office, they were met by Dr. Simmons, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a clipboard in hand. "What seems to be the problem?" he asked, glancing between Mandy and her parents, his demeanor calm and professional. Mandy's mother spoke first, detailing her daughter's strange behavior and the concerns that had driven them to seek help. As she spoke, Mandy felt the room growing heavier, shadows pooling in the corners, whispering their deceitful promises. She could barely focus on her mother's words, the sound of her own heartbeat drowning everything else out. "From what you're describing, it sounds like stress or anxiety," Dr. Simmons said, his voice soothing yet firm. "College can be overwhelming, especially with the pressures of academic life. I think a short course of medication might help her feel more grounded." He scribbled a prescription, but Mandy's mind was elsewhere, lost in a haze of swirling shadows and whispers that urged her to retreat further into the darkness. As she sat there, she noticed the way the lights flickered occasionally, a brief dance of darkness that felt almost intentional, as if the very clinic was aware of her struggle. Just as they were about to leave, a sudden commotion erupted in the waiting room. A child's scream pierced the air, cutting through the ambient noise like a knife. Mandy's head snapped towards the source, her heart racing as she felt an overwhelming urge to flee. The shadowy figures at the edge of her vision seemed to pulse with excitement, coaxing her to lose herself in the chaos. The mother of the screaming child rushed out, panic etched across her face, while the nurse tried to calm the child, who was clutching at her throat. It was a scene that felt surreal, unsettling in its intensity, as Mandy's world tilted on its axis. In the midst of the commotion, Mandy's body responded in ways she couldn't control. A low growl slipped from her lips, a sound that felt foreign and unsettling. Her parents turned, alarmed, but she couldn't meet their eyes. The whispers were louder now, drowning out her own thoughts. "You see, they don't understand," the shadows hissed. "They'll never know what you truly are." She clenched her fists, nails digging into her palms as she fought against the rising tide of darkness, but the shadows tightened their grip, urging her deeper into their fold. Once they were back in the car, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken words. "How did it go?" her father asked, trying to maintain a sense of normalcy. But Mandy merely shrugged, the weight of her silence pressing down like a lead blanket. The prescription bottle rattled softly in her mother's hands, a small token of hope that felt more like a curse. They drove home in silence, the shadows whispering promises of power and freedom, drowning out the worry radiating from her parents. Days passed, and Mandy reluctantly began taking the medication. At first, there was a flicker of hope, a brief moment where she felt lighter, as if the chains binding her were loosening ever so slightly. But it didn't last long. The shadows only grew bolder, their whispers turning into taunts that echoed in her mind. "They think they can save you," they cooed, wrapping around her like a cold embrace. "But they're only pushing you further away. You're one of us now." The following week brought yet another appointment with Dr. Simmons, where they would evaluate her progress. As they entered the office, the doctor greeted them with a smile, but there was an underlying tension in the air, a heaviness that Mandy could sense. Her parents were hopeful, but Mandy felt a sense of dread pooling in her stomach. What would he say this time? Would he see the changes within her, or would he dismiss her struggles as mere side effects of the medication? During the consultation, strange incidents began to unfold. The lights flickered more frequently, casting shadows that danced and twisted along the walls. The doctor's voice echoed strangely, the syllables warping and distorting in her ears, making it difficult for her to concentrate. It felt as if the room itself was alive, pulsing with an energy that seemed to react to her presence. Whenever she glanced towards the corners, she could see the shadows shifting, their forms coiling and stretching like serpents, watching her every move. As the doctor began discussing the medication's effects, Mandy's vision blurred, colors bleeding together in a surreal whirl. She felt as though she were spiraling, losing her grip on reality. "Are you listening, Mandy?" Dr. Simmons asked, concern etched into his features. But she was far away, lost in a realm where whispers morphed into laughter, and laughter turned to screams. "You're slipping, my dear," the shadows taunted, their voices laced with glee. "You won't escape us. Not now. Not ever." The conversation ended, but the heaviness remained, settling into the pit of her stomach as they left the clinic. Her parents were oblivious, still hopeful that the medication would work, that their daughter would return to them. Mandy felt the cold grip of the shadows tightening around her heart, feeding off her despair, growing stronger with every passing day. She forced a smile for her parents, but inside the battle was raging, and the shadows were winning. Mandy's condition continued to deteriorate, each day bleeding into the next as shadows deepened in her eyes and despair crept further into her heart. The medication had dulled her edges, but the darkness inside her thrived, festering in the corners of her mind. Her parents clung to their hope that she would recover, but the house was filled with an uneasy tension, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something terrible to unfold. Despite her parents' reassurances and the doctor's prescriptions, a palpable sense of dread settled over them, echoing in every creak of the floorboards and rustle of leaves outside. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Mandy sat alone in her room, surrounded by her belongings that now felt alien to her. The once vibrant posters of her favorite bands hung limply, shadows stretching across them as if they were reaching for her. She gazed at her reflection in the mirror, her face a ghostly mask, eyes sunken and dull. As the shadows began to close in, the whispers returned, curling around her thoughts like smoke. "You don't belong here anymore. They can't help you." They hissed, and for a brief moment, she felt a surge of defiance wash over her. That same evening, her parents were sitting in the living room, anxiety gnawing at them as they discussed their daughter's alarming decline. "Maybe we should call Dr. Simmons," her mother suggested, wringing her hands anxiously. "I just don't feel right about this," her father nodded, the lines on his forehead deepening as he contemplated their next steps. "Let's give it a few more days, but I don't want to ignore this," he replied, his voice laced with concern. The weight of their helplessness hung heavy in the air, amplifying their fears that they might be losing her. Later that night, the doctor arrived, his brow furrowed as he stepped into the dimly lit home. Dr. Simmons had always been calm and collected, but there was an edge to his demeanor now, a tension that seemed to pulse between him and the anxious parents. They welcomed him into their home, offering him a seat on the couch, while Mandy remained locked away in her room. "I wanted to check in on Mandy, see how she's doing," he said, but his voice lacked the usual confidence he exuded during appointments. He could sense the shift in the atmosphere, the palpable fear that permeated the walls. "She's not doing well," her father admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "She hasn't been herself at all, and we're worried. It's like she's fading away." Dr. Simmons nodded, his mind racing with possibilities as he prepared himself for what he might find. "I think it would be beneficial to talk to her directly," he said, trying to maintain a facade of professionalism, despite the unease bubbling beneath the surface. As he stood to walk toward her room, the air felt charged, as though the very house was alive with a hidden presence. Mandy heard the soft knock on her door, the sound echoing in her mind like a distant memory. "Mandy, it's Dr. Simmons," the doctor called gently, trying to project reassurance into the darkness surrounding her. She paused, a twisted smile spreading across her face, her mind clouded with shadows that whispered promises of strength and power. "Come in," she replied, her voice a low murmur that sent a chill down the doctor's spine. The door creaked open, revealing the unsettling sight of Mandy sitting cross-legged on her bed, shrouded in darkness. "Mandy, how are you feeling?" Dr. Simmons asked, attempting to gauge her state of mind. Her eyes flickered to his momentarily clear before clouding over again with a void that seemed to swallow the light around her. "I'm fine," she replied, her tone unsettlingly calm, as if the storm within her had settled into a deceptive stillness. He stepped closer, noting the unnatural pallor of her skin and the way shadows seemed to cling to her, enveloping her in a cloak of unease. "Your parents are worried about you," he continued, but she only smiled wider, a grin that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You're worried too, aren't you?" she said, her voice taking on a mocking lilt. The air around them felt thick, a tension so dense that it pressed against Dr. Simmons's chest. "You think I'm just some sad little girl, but you're the one with secrets." Her eyes gleamed with a predatory light, and he felt a chill race down his spine. "You think I don't see it? The way you look at your patients. The way you pretend to care while hiding your own demons." Her words were a dagger, twisting into him with an unsettling precision. Dr. Simmons took a cautious step back, his instincts screaming at him to flee. "Mandy, I think we should focus on you," he stammered, trying to regain control of the conversation, but she leaned forward, her gaze piercing into him like a blade. "You're not the authority here," she whispered, her voice dropping to a guttural rasp. "You're just a scared little man in a white coat." Suddenly a flicker of darkness swept through the room, and the lights above them began to flicker erratically, casting dancing shadows that warped and twisted along the walls. "Mandy, please." "This isn't helping," Dr. Simmons urged, the growing unease palpable as he glanced toward the door, considering his escape. But before he could move, she surged forward, her hand outstretched as if reaching for something unseen. "What do you fear most, Doctor?" she asked, her voice rising to a frantic pitch. "Is it the way you failed your wife? The way you couldn't save her from her own pain?" The accusation hung in the air like a noxious fog, suffocating him. As Dr. Simmons stumbled back, a twisted smile spread across Mandy's face, a dark pleasure dancing in her eyes. "You think you know what it's like to help people," she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper that cut through the air. The atmosphere thickened with her words, each syllable weighted with accusation, and he felt a cold sweat trickle down his spine. "What about your wife, Doctor? Remember the nights you left her side while she lay dying?" The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to pulse, amplifying the foreboding tension that hung between them. "Mandy," he started, his voice shaking, but she cut him off with a wave of her hand, a dismissive gesture that held an unnerving finality. "Oh, don't play coy with me. You think I don't know? I know everything. How you slipped away to be with that nurse, what was her name? Emily. While your wife cried for your help, she was too sick to even notice, but I do." Each word dripped with malice, like venom pooling in the air, as she watched him recoil from her accusations. The room felt colder, and the flickering light overhead cast eerie shadows that seemed to dance in anticipation. "Did you think she wouldn't find out?" Mandy continued, her voice rising with an unsettling cadence as she paced in front of him like a predator circling its prey. "She knew. You couldn't hide it from her forever. The way you looked at your patients like they were your lifeline. when in reality you were just looking for another escape? Or what about that time with your receptionist? Such a lovely little thing, eager and naive. You thought it was a secret, didn't you? But your wife had her suspicions, and they gnawed at her until the air grew thick with dread, and Dr. Simmons felt trapped, the weight of her revelations pressing down on him. As he shifted uncomfortably, Mandy leaned closer, her eyes narrowing with a predatory intensity. You were the one who was supposed to save her, yet all you did was betray her. When she needed you most, you chose pleasure over duty. And now look at you, sitting here, pretending to help me while the shadows of your sins loom over you. Her voice dropped to a chilling whisper, reverberating with an unholy echo. You think this is going to end well for you? You'll pay for what you did, and I will make sure you remember every moment of your failure. With every taunt, she could see his confidence falter, crumbling beneath the weight of her accusations. You thought you could just bury it all, didn't you? You thought you could forget, but I'm here to remind you. Her lips curled into a smile that held no warmth, and for a moment, the very air around them seemed to vibrate with a sinister energy, as if the room itself had become an unwilling witness to the doctor's dark past. Mandy stepped closer, invading his personal space, and the shadows flickered in response. What's it like, Doctor? Living with the knowledge that you failed her, that you chose to be with someone else while your wife lay alone in her hospital bed, begging for your presence. You were her hero, but you threw it all away. The look on his face, a mix of horror and shame, was intoxicating, fueling her dark satisfaction. And don't think I don't know about your favorite patients, the ones that come into your office for the routine checkups they don't need, she continued, her tone dripping with scorn. You're just another man in a white coat, pretending to be a savior while your heart is as dark as the secrets you hide. What's the matter, Dr. Simmons? Is the truth too much for you to bear? Her laughter echoed in the small room, cruel and mocking, a sound that resonated with the very depths of his buried guilt. Dr. Simmons opened his mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, a cold dread settled in the pit of his stomach, and he took a step back, feeling the oppressive weight of her presence. The shadows seemed to close in around him, dark tendrils creeping toward him, as if they were eager to snatch away his defenses. He felt the color drain from his face as memories flooded back images of her pallid face, the whispered words of despair that had echoed through the walls of their home. Stop it, Mandy, he shouted, panic bubbling up in his throat, but she only laughed, the sound shrill and manic, reverberating through the room. Oh, but you can't stop what you can't see. Can you feel them, Doctor? The eyes that watch you, waiting for your next mistake, her voice twisted into a mocking sing-song, echoing with an eerie resonance. Mandy reclined on her bed, her body languid and inviting as she propped herself up on her elbows, casting the doctor a sultry, knowing smile. You know, Doctor, she said, her voice dripping with seduction, I could be the distraction you need. Her tone was a velvety whisper, each word wrapped in allure. The soft lighting in her room flickered, casting tantalizing shadows that danced across the walls, giving her an almost ethereal quality. It must be so lonely for you, she purred, a teasing lilt in her voice, wandering through the empty halls of your home, longing for the warmth of someone to hold on to. Don't you ever miss the thrill of intimacy, the connection that brings two souls together? As she spoke, Mandy shifted, her movements slow and deliberate, as if every gesture was choreographed to draw his gaze. She leaned closer, a smirk curling on her lips. But I wonder, she continued, her voice sultry and low, are you too trapped in your vices to reach out for something real? I can sense the ache of your loneliness, the desperation hidden beneath your practiced facade. Her eyes sparkled with mischief. a predatory glint revealing her intentions. Imagine the heat of someone next to you, the sweet surrender of being with someone who truly desires you. It's been so long, hasn't it? How does it feel to know that all those whispers of comfort are lost in shadows? You could have had it all, yet here you are, drowning in regret. Her voice dropped to a whisper, thick with temptation. Tell me, doctor, do you think of those late-night fantasies? The ones you buried under layers of guilt and shame? Picture this me, right here, in your arms, letting go of all your worries, all your secrets. Wouldn't it be nice to have someone who understands you? Someone willing to explore the darkest corners of your mind. She leaned back slightly, her eyes locking onto his, daring him to look away. Mandy's laughter was soft but resonant, filling the room with an unsettling charm. So many desires left unfulfilled, so many chances missed. You're just a man after all, aren't you? Alone and aching, haunted by the choices you've made. Does it gnaw at you? Knowing you could have chosen differently, her smile widened, a hint of wickedness flashing in her eyes. And what if I could be that spark to reignite your passion, to remind you of the thrill of feeling alive? The air thickened with tension as she continued, each word laced with dark allure. Imagine the two of us, tangled together in a world where nothing else matters, where your secrets and my darkness collide. Can you see it? Can you feel the pull, the electric chemistry crackling between us? Just think of it, doctor. Her voice was barely above a whisper, yet it echoed with an intoxicating promise, leaving him breathless and uneasy. As she leaned in even closer, the scent of her shampoo filled the air, a blend of jasmine and something darker, something almost intoxicating. You know, I'm not just some patient to be treated. I'm a woman who craves connection, who understands the shadows you hide in. Let's not pretend. We both know you want this. You want me. Her eyes narrowed slightly, a predatory gleam flickering within. So, tell me, are you ready to confront your own darkness, or will you let it consume you, just like you consumed everything else? The room grew thick with an unsettling tension, each heartbeat amplified as she pulled him into her web of seduction, making the doctor question not only his professionalism but also the very fabric of his morality. Suddenly, with a burst of energy, Mandy lunged at him, and Dr. Simmons barely managed to sidestep her grasp. She crashed into the wall, leaving a dent in the plaster, but the moment only seemed to embolden her. You think you can control this, she spat, her eyes blazing with a fierce intensity. You're just as weak as I am, and you know it. The shadows writhed around her, and for a fleeting moment he saw a dark figure flicker behind her, its form obscured by the swirling gloom. Dr. Simmons staggered backward, heart racing as he desperately sought an escape from the oppressive weight of her words and the mounting dread surrounding her. The air in the room felt thick and electric, crackling with an energy that pulsed in time with Mandy's erratic breathing. You'll regret coming here, she hissed, and suddenly the lights burst into a shower of sparks, plunging the room into darkness. In that moment, all he could hear was her low, mocking laughter echoing in the void, a sound that crawled beneath his skin. Just when he thought he might escape, she was in front of him again, her face inches away from his, twisted with a sinister grin that sent chills racing down his spine. You want to know what happens next? She whispered, her voice a haunting melody that lingered in the air. You'll never forget me, doctor. I'm going to show you what true fear looks like. With that, the darkness seemed to swallow them whole, a vortex of terror that left him gasping for breath, trapped in a nightmare he could not wake from. As the room fell silent, the doctor stumbled backward, realizing with a sickening dread that Mandy was no longer the girl he had come to help. The shadows had taken her, and he felt a deep-seated terror clawing at his heart, understanding that this was something far beyond his grasp. She was not just a troubled young woman, she was a vessel for something ancient and malevolent, and he was standing on the precipice of an abyss. He barely had time to react before she was upon him, her hands outstretched with an unsettling mix of desperation and malice. The look in her eyes was feral, filled with a darkness that sent chills down his spine. Adrenaline surging through his veins, he sprinted toward the door, heart pounding, and slammed it shut behind him, locking it with trembling hands. The sound of her frustrated scream echoed through the thin walls, a haunting reminder of the entity that now controlled her. The doctor leaned against the door, catching his breath as he tried to process what had just happened. The calm professionalism he had relied on had crumbled, replaced by a visceral fear of the girl he had come to help. He could still hear her shrieks, laced with a chaotic energy that felt otherworldly. Steeling himself, he turned away from the door and stepped down the dimly lit hallway, his mind racing with concern for Mandy and dread at the implications of her behavior. When he finally reached the living room, Mandy's parents were sitting on the couch, worry etched into their faces. They had been anxiously waiting, hoping for good news, but the doctor's expression betrayed the truth. He cleared his throat, ready to break the news that would change everything. I don't know how to say this, he began, his voice faltering. Mandy's condition is unlike anything I've encountered before. The mother's eyes widened, and her hand flew to her mouth. What do you mean? Is she going to be okay? Her voice quivered with anxiety. The father leaned forward, a sense of urgency in his demeanor. What are you talking about? Just tell us what's wrong with our daughter. The doctor sighed heavily, struggling to find the right words. I think she's suffering from something beyond the reach of modern medicine. I know this sounds unbelievable, but there are signs of something supernatural at play. He watched their reactions closely, knowing the weight of what he was suggesting. Mandy's father shook his head in disbelief, anger flashing in his eyes. Are you saying my daughter is possessed? That's absurd. She's just stressed. She's going through a lot at school. The father's denial was palpable, but the doctor pressed on. I wish it were that simple. I've seen many cases of anxiety and depression, but this feels different. The mother's hands trembled as she clutched the fabric of her dress. But what can we do? Can't you help her? The doctor hesitated, searching for the right response. I can offer medication, but I fear it won't work in this situation. I think we need to consult someone who specializes in cases like this. Mandy's parents exchanged worried glances, uncertainty looming over them. You mean like a priest? Is that really necessary? The father asked, skepticism creeping into his tone. The doctor nodded gravely. I have a friend who deals with these kinds of situations. He's knowledgeable about the spiritual aspects that we simply can't address. The father's brow furrowed, his voice firm. This is our daughter's life we're talking about. Are you saying that a priest can do what you can't? The doctor met his gaze, determination igniting within him. I believe that if there is any chance of helping her, we must explore every avenue, even the ones that seem unconventional. Mandy's mother began to sob softly, her hands pressed against her cheeks. Please do whatever it takes. We can't lose her. The doctor's heart ached for the family. He could see the pain etched in their features, the fear of losing their daughter looming over them like a dark cloud. I'll reach out to my friend right away, he assured them. As he turned to leave, the weight of the decision hung heavy in the air. He understood that some people would dismiss this as superstition, yet he felt a primal instinct pushing him to explore every possibility for Mandy's sake. He had witnessed too many inexplicable things recently to ignore the urgency of the situation. The doctor pulled out his phone, fingers trembling slightly as he typed out a message to his friend, hoping that they could provide the insights needed to navigate this unsettling darkness. He glanced back at Mandy's parents, who sat huddled together on the couch, fear etched into their faces, and whispered a silent prayer for their daughter's safety. With a deep breath, he stepped outside, the cool air hitting his face like a cold slap. It felt refreshing yet heavy with the weight of the night. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a much darker journey. He had to believe there was still hope for Mandy, despite the shadows that had begun to close in around her. The week passed agonizingly slow, each day a constant battle against the darkness that encroached upon Mandy's life. Her parents were mired in worry, unable to shake the feeling that their daughter was slipping further away with each passing hour. They had tried to engage her, to coax some semblance of the spirited girl they once knew, but Mandy had become a hollow shell, her laughter replaced by eerie silences. Shadows seemed to cling to her, whispering secrets that only she could hear, driving her deeper into her isolation. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, a chill seeped into the house, mirroring the growing unease within its walls. The doctor, having been on the phone with Mandy's family multiple times, finally decided to pay a visit himself. His brow furrowed in concern, knowing that the days of waiting were taking a toll on Mandy and her family. He had never witnessed such a rapid decline in a patient, and it gnawed at him like a persistent itch he couldn't scratch. On the day of the priest's arrival, the air was thick with anticipation. The family awaited Father Martinez in the living room, tension coiling tightly around them. As they sat in silence, they exchanged worried glances, the unease palpable. "We need to be ready for whatever comes next," Mandy's father finally said, his voice low but resolute. The others nodded, knowing that the moment they had been dreading was almost upon them. When the doorbell rang, it felt as though the air had been sucked from the room. The doctor opened the door, revealing Father Martinez, who stepped inside with a grave expression. "Thank you for coming," the doctor said, gesturing for the priest to enter. They exchanged knowing glances, both acutely aware that the situation was dire and that they were about to confront something beyond their understanding. After exchanging pleasantries, the priest wasted no time. "I've been informed of Mandy's condition," he began, his voice steady yet solemn. "What I have seen in my years as a priest leads me to believe that this may be a case of possession. I know it sounds extreme, but we must consider all possibilities." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication, and the parents felt a chill crawl up their spines. "Her behavior has been erratic," the doctor interjected, his expression grim. "She is exhibiting signs of paranoia, aggressive behavior, and severe mood swings. I'm not equipped to handle this alone," the priest nodded, acknowledging the severity of the situation. "I can offer my assistance, but we need to approach this delicately. I've encountered cases like this before, and it can escalate quickly." The gravity of his words weighed heavily on the family. "I believe an exorcism may be necessary if the situation doesn't improve," the priest continued, his tone serious. The family absorbed the weight of his words, realizing that they were standing at a precipice. "I know this sounds terrifying, but if she is possessed, we need to act quickly. Waiting any longer could be dangerous." The idea of an exorcism felt both foreign and frightening, yet they understood that Mandy's well-being had to take precedence over their apprehensions. They sat in heavy silence for a moment, the gravity of the situation pressing down on them. Mandy's father glanced at his wife, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "We have to believe that she can come back to us," he murmured, a determination sparking within him. They all felt a flicker of hope amidst the shadows, a fragile light that they would cling to as they prepared for the storm to come. As the night deepened outside, the doctor looked to the priest. "Can you guide us through this?" he asked, his voice steady but filled with trepidation. The priest nodded firmly, resolute in his belief that they could help Mandy. Together they steeled themselves for what lay ahead, knowing that they would have to face the darkness that had taken root within her and hope that they could save her before it was too late. The staircase leading to Mandy's room creaked ominously underfoot, the sound echoing throughout the otherwise quiet house. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, as Father Martinez led the way, the doctor following closely behind. Mandy's parents, anxious and fearful, trailed just behind them, their hearts pounding with dread. Each step upward felt like an ascent into darkness, a descent into a nightmare that had invaded their once peaceful home. The flickering light from a nearby lamp illuminated the hallway, casting long shadows that danced and twisted, heightening their sense of impending doom. Reaching the door to Mandy's room, Father Martinez hesitated for a moment, steeling himself. He exchanged a glance with the doctor and Mandy's parents, who nodded, urging him forward. Taking a deep breath, the priest pushed the door open, and they stepped into a realm that felt utterly alien. The room was dimly lit, the curtains drawn tight, allowing only slivers of light to penetrate the gloom. Posters that once depicted colorful landscapes now seemed faded and lifeless, like ghosts of a happier past. Mandy sat hunched on her bed, her posture rigid and unnatural, as if she were a marionette with tangled strings. Her hair hung in disheveled strands, framing her face like a dark halo, and her skin appeared pallid, almost sickly. The once vibrant spark in her eyes had been replaced with an unsettling emptiness, a void that sent shivers down their spines. She looked up as they entered, her expression morphing into one of mocking amusement, as though she were a spectator to their collective fear. "Look who finally decided to drop by," Mandy said, her voice laced with an eerie cadence that seemed to reverberate off the walls. "Doctor, did you miss me? I've been waiting for you." Her words dripped with a sinister playfulness, and her smile, too wide, too sharp, sent an electric chill through the air. The doctor's heart raced, recalling their last encounter when she had tried to seduce him with a confidence that now felt twisted and wrong. "Stay back," he stammered, the gravity of her gaze unsettling him. "You're not well, Mandy," but she only laughed, a chilling sound that echoed in the confined space, sending a wave of unease rippling through the air. "Well? Are you going to give me a proper greeting? After all, I've been practicing my moves just for you," she taunted, her eyes narrowing in playful menace as she leaned back on the bed, one leg crossed over the other, mimicking a sultry pose. "Why don't we turn this into a show?" Mandy suggested, her voice sultry yet laced with malice. She gestured theatrically to her parents and the priest, a wicked smile curling her lips. "I mean, wouldn't it be delightful for them to witness this little performance? They can see how well you handle the sick girl in her most vulnerable state." Her eyes sparkled with a sinister amusement, as if she found pleasure in the discomfort radiating from those around her. After all, nothing spices up a family reunion like a bit of forbidden play.
Right.
The air grew thick with tension, and the mocking tone in her voice sent a shiver down the doctor's spine as he felt the boundaries of decency unraveling. The doctor clenched his fists, trying to maintain his composure. "This isn't a joke," he said, attempting to sound authoritative. "We're here to help you." Mandy's laughter faded, replaced by a chilling silence. "Help." Oh, how quaint, she purred, her tone laced with mockery. "What would you know about help, doctor? You're just as lost as I am, aren't you?" Her gaze sharpened, and she seemed to penetrate the very depths of his soul, laying bare his insecurities. As Father Martinez stepped forward, clutching a rosary tightly in his hand, he felt the room's atmosphere shift, growing heavier with malevolence. "Mandy," he began, trying to reach the girl he once knew, "we need you to fight this. Whatever is inside you, we can help." She cocked her head, her expression morphing into one of amusement. "Fight? "Oh, Father, you have no idea how much fun it is to let go," she whispered, her voice dropping to a seductive tone that sent shivers through the priest. "I can show you things you've never dreamed of," she continued, her eyes dancing with a predatory glint. "Secrets buried deep, whispers that linger in the shadows. You've walked in darkness too, haven't you? The confessions you've heard, the lives you've ruined." Her words dripped with malice, weaving a web of insinuations that caused both men to falter. The priest swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her accusations pressing down on him, even if they were fabricated. "Enough of this," the doctor interjected, his voice shaky but firm. "You need to stop playing games, Mandy. This is serious." Mandy leaned closer, her smile widening, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp. "Serious? Oh, sweet doctor, it's only going to get worse from here," she hissed, the air in the room thickening with her ominous words. "Why don't you ask me about the things I know? I see them all. Every secret you think you've hidden." The tension in the room reached a breaking point, the walls seemingly closing in around them. Father Martinez took a deep breath, his heart racing as he realized the darkness had enveloped Mandy entirely. "Mandy, we're here to help you," he insisted, trying to maintain a semblance of calm despite the fear that clawed at him. "But you must let us in. You have to fight against whatever is consuming you." Mandy leaned back on her bed, a bemused expression playing across her features. "Oh, but you're wrong, Father. I'm not the one fighting. It's you who should be afraid." Her words hung in the air, thick with menace, as she watched them, a predator observing its prey. The priest and doctor exchanged a glance, both feeling the weight of her twisted confidence. Whatever had taken hold of Mandy was far more powerful than they had anticipated, and they knew they were teetering on the edge of a darkness that threatened to consume them all. The air in Mandy's room was electric, thick with the weight of dread and anticipation. As the priest stepped forward, clutching his holy water and crucifix tightly, he felt an unshakable chill crawl up his spine. Mandy lay on her bed, her once soft features now twisted in an unsettling grimace. Her eyes, once warm and inviting, had turned into dark, hollow voids that seemed to peer into the very souls of those around her. The doctor and Mandy's parents stood behind the priest, hearts racing as they braced themselves for what was about to unfold. "By the power of God, I command you to leave this vessel," the priest declared, his voice steady yet tinged with urgency. He splashed holy water across the room, the droplets hissing as they landed on the floor. Mandy recoiled as if burned, her laughter echoing like a sinister melody through the dimly lit space. "You think that little trick will work on me?" Pathetic, she sneered, her voice layered with a guttural undertone that sent shivers through everyone present. The room felt alive with a malevolent energy, the shadows around her stretching and warping, as if in response to her defiance. As the priest began reciting incantations with fervor, the atmosphere shifted. Each word he spoke resonated through the room, stirring an unseen force that pushed back against the encroaching darkness. Mandy's body jerked violently, her back arching unnaturally as she writhed on the bed. The demon's influence was palpable, her limbs contorted in ways that defied human limits, and her skin glistened with a sheen of sweat, as if struggling against an internal battle. "You think you can save her?" The voice of the demon twisted through her lips, now sounding like a chorus of tortured souls, layered and sinister. The priest pressed on, undeterred by the taunts, his faith bolstering his resolve. As he chanted, strange sounds filled the air, whispers in languages he could not comprehend, mingling with Mandy's cries. It was as if the very walls were alive with the presence of dark spirits, pushing against the barrier of light the priest sought to maintain. "Mandy, fight it. You have to fight," he urged, but his words seemed to evaporate into the surrounding darkness. Instead of hope, An overwhelming sense of despair washed over them all, as Mandy's laughter echoed around the room, a cacophony of mockery and malice. The tension in the room escalated, and the temperature plummeted, sending chills racing down their spines. "Do you feel her slipping away?" the demon taunted, its voice dripping with malice. It seeped into their minds, forcing them to confront their worst fears, but the priest pressed on. With unwavering determination, he invoked the name of God, raising the crucifix high above his head. "In the name of God, I command you to leave this girl," his voice rang out, imbued with an intensity that filled the room. Mandy's body convulsed, her features momentarily shifting back to the innocent girl her family once knew. "Help me," she gasped, but the plea was swallowed by the dark laughter that erupted around her, taunting and mocking. The priest felt the power of the demon surge, pushing against him like a tidal wave of darkness. Shadows seemed to writhe and twist around Mandy, forming tendrils that lashed out, seeking to ensnare him in their grasp. Pathetic. "You think your little prayers can save her?" "I own her now," the demon roared, the very air around them vibrating with its fury. The shadows clawed at the priest, trying to exploit any crack in his faith, but he pressed on, drawing strength from the love and hope of those surrounding him. "Mandy, we are here for you," he shouted, aiming to reach the part of her that still remained untouched. Yet the battle was fierce. Her body thrashed violently as if fighting against invisible chains, the room pulsating with dark energy. The priest leaned closer, focusing on the flickering remnants of Mandy's true self buried deep within. "Mandy, if you can hear me, fight. You are stronger than this darkness. Remember who you are," he implored, his heart racing with the weight of the moment. Her body fell limp for a heartbeat, a flicker of recognition flashing in her eyes, but it was quickly drowned out by the wrath of the demon. "You think you can reach her?" the entity hissed, its voice a chilling blend of languages, shifting and swirling as if it had no true form. In a final push, the priest called upon the power of the divine, raising the crucifix higher. "In the name of God, I command you to leave this body," he cried out, his voice echoing against the walls, merging with the frantic heartbeat of the room. The air thickened with anticipation as they all held their breath, awaiting the moment that would determine Mandy's fate. But then the demon unleashed a guttural roar, and the air shifted again, thick with malice. "You think your faith can stop me?" it spat, a whirlwind of darkness swirling around Mandy. The battle raged on, and the room felt like a battleground, with the priest standing firm against the onslaught of evil. The shadows clawed at him, trying to drag him down into the depths of despair, but he refused to yield. "You will not take her," he shouted defiantly, pouring every ounce of his faith into the fight for Mandy's soul. As he continued, Mandy's body convulsed violently, and her eyes flared with a dark light. The room seemed to tremble, the very walls resonating with the intensity of the struggle. With the fate of Mandy hanging in the balance, the priest steeled himself, preparing for one final incantation. "By the light of God, I command you to leave this girl," he cried out, his voice rising above the tumult. Shadows twisted and danced, clawing at the priest, yet he pressed on, drawing strength from the visible breath of his allies, her parents and the doctor fighting alongside him. The energy in the room shifted, and a palpable tension enveloped them all as they clung to the hope that they could pull Mandy back from the abyss. As the priest continued, the walls of the room pulsed with an otherworldly energy, vibrating in rhythm with the chaos that unfolded. Mandy's laughter morphed into a deep, menacing growl, filling the room with palpable malice. The air crackled with tension as the demon shrieked in defiance, voices mingling in a cacophony of chaos. The priest's heart raced as he felt the full weight of the battle. He could not falter now. The shadows swirled violently, and Mandy's body lifted off the bed, contorting in unnatural ways as she struggled against the oppressive force within. Mandy's voice echoed through the room, layered with an eerie distortion as it switched between her own and that of the demon. "She's weak. This body belongs to me," the shadows writhed, and her form twisted and shifted, a grotesque mimicry of her former self. The priest, driven by determination, pushed against the encroaching darkness. The room felt alive, pulsating with the struggle between light and dark as the forces of evil fought back with fierce intensity. As the exorcism reached its climax, the priest's voice rose above the turmoil, an unwavering beacon of hope. "I stand against you, spirit of evil. You have no claim here." With a final, resounding declaration, the air around them crackled with power, and Mandy's body convulsed as the darkness clawed for dominance. Shadows screamed and shrieked, twisting into forms that seemed to claw at reality itself, while the priest held firm against the chaos, determined to free Mandy from the grips of evil. The moment Mandy's body went limp, a low, sinister laugh echoed through the room, chilling the air and sending shivers down the spines of everyone present. The priest felt a jolt of dread as he realized the demon was attempting to manipulate their perceptions. "You think you've won," a voice hissed from Mandy's lips. But it wasn't her voice, its timbre was guttural, dark and menacing. The room grew colder, and the lights flickered ominously. Mandy's eyes fluttered open again, but this time they were clouded with a malevolent darkness. "Look at her," the demon continued, grinning through Mandy's features, the mockery evident in its tone. "She's yours now, and you have no power over me. You're too late to save her." The priest gripped the edges of his robes, his heart racing. He exchanged a worried glance with the doctor, who stepped back slightly, apprehension written all over his face. The other family members remained frozen, terror gripping their hearts as they witnessed the horror unfold before them. It was clear that the demon was trying to sow discord and confusion, to weaken their resolve. The priest quickly gathered his thoughts, recalling the lessons of old, the exorcisms that had taken many lives to master. "You are not her," he declared, his voice strong and unwavering. "You have no claim over this soul. In the name of God, I command you to leave her." He stepped forward, brandishing the holy water, the small vial trembling slightly in his grasp. The demon's laughter filled the room, reverberating off the walls, as if mocking the priest's conviction. "Your faith is a feeble weapon, priest. You're nothing without your little trinkets." Suddenly, Mandy's body convulsed violently, her limbs thrashing against the bed. The doctor and Mandy's parents rushed to hold her down, desperate to prevent her from hurting herself. "We can't let her go. Hold her tight," the doctor shouted, his voice rising above the chaos. The room transformed into a battleground, and despite the horror, their determination intensified. The priest felt the weight of their collective fear and love, an energy that pushed him forward, urging him to fight harder. As they pinned her down, the demon snarled, its voice dripping with venom. "You think you can contain me? You're all fools. I've been in her longer than you can imagine." Mandy's eyes rolled back, and for a moment it seemed as if the demon had regained control. But the priest, unwavering, recited an incantation passed down through generations, his voice echoing like a rallying cry. "In the name of God, I demand you leave this child." With every word he uttered, the atmosphere shifted, growing heavier and more oppressive. Mandy's body strained against their hold, her muscles taut as if a great battle were being waged within her. The priest felt a surge of power, as if the very walls of the room were vibrating with his faith. "You are nothing but a parasite, and your time here is over," he proclaimed, louder and more resolute than before, channeling every ounce of his strength into the words. The demon screeched, a horrific sound that echoed through the room like a banshee's wail, its voice fluctuating as it struggled to maintain its grip. "You will regret this. She is mine. You'll pay for your arrogance." But the priest pressed on, and as the others held Mandy down, their collective will became a shield, a barrier against the darkness threatening to engulf them. The air crackled with tension, and Mandy's body shook violently, thrashing as if caught in the throes of a storm. In that critical moment, the priest felt an overwhelming rush of clarity and strength. "By the power of the Almighty, I command you to leave this vessel," he shouted, and as the last word left his lips, the atmosphere in the room shifted once more. A blinding light seemed to emanate from Mandy, engulfing her in a halo of luminescence. The demon's hold weakened, the screeching turning into desperate howls, reverberating off the walls and shaking the very foundation of their beliefs. With a final, earth-shattering scream, the demon exploded outward, the darkness swirling around them like smoke dissipating into the wind. Mandy's body went limp again, but this time her breaths were steady, her face serene. The room fell silent, the oppressive weight lifting as the light dimmed. The priest staggered back, breathless but triumphant, his heart racing with the realization that they had finally succeeded in reclaiming Mandy's soul. As the final words of the priest faded into the air, a deafening silence enveloped the room. Mandy's body fell limply onto the bed, her chest rising and falling in shallow, erratic breaths. The shadows that had loomed so ominously seemed to retreat, dissipating like smoke in the morning light. The priest staggered back, panting heavily as he glanced around at the faces of Mandy's family and the doctor, their expressions a mix of disbelief and tentative hope. Had they truly succeeded, or was this just a momentary reprieve from the darkness that had claimed her? The doctor stepped forward, his face pale and drawn. He knelt beside the bed, checking Mandy's vitals, his hands shaking slightly as he felt the steady thrum of her pulse beneath his fingertips. "She's alive," he whispered, almost to himself, yet the relief in his voice was palpable. But as he glanced up at her parents, their faces were etched with worry. "We need to monitor her closely. This could be just the beginning of her recovery." His words hung heavily in the air, a stark reminder that the battle they had fought might leave scars deeper than they could see. Mandy stirred slightly, her eyelids fluttering open, revealing bloodshot eyes that darted around the room. For a fleeting moment, there was clarity, a glimpse of the girl they all knew and loved. "What happened?" she murmured, her voice hoarse and fragile. Her parents rushed to her side, tears streaming down their faces as they wrapped their arms around her, their relief mingling with lingering fear. "You're safe now, sweetheart. We're here." Her mother croaked, the weight of the ordeal evident in her trembling voice. Yet even in that moment of tenderness, an unsettling energy lingered, a reminder of the darkness that had threatened to consume her. As they held Mandy close, the priest stepped back, his heart heavy with the knowledge that the battle was far from over. He could still feel the malevolent presence that had once inhabited her, its echoes reverberating in the corners of his mind. "Mandy, you need to listen to me," he said, his voice firm yet compassionate. "You may feel different. The darkness may try to return, but you have to fight it. You are stronger than you know." His words resonated in the stillness, a solemn promise that her journey toward healing would be a long and arduous one. The atmosphere in the room was thick with uncertainty, a tension that clung to them like a fog. Mandy's eyes flickered with confusion, shadows dancing in the periphery of her vision. I don't remember," she began, her voice trailing off as the weight of her past loomed before her. The priest exchanged a glance with the doctor, both understanding that the true struggle was only just beginning. As they surrounded Mandy with love and support, an unspoken agreement formed, a collective resolve to confront whatever darkness still lingered. In the days following the exorcism, Mandy lay in her bed, enveloped in a cocoon of silence that felt both comforting and strange. The shadows in her room seemed less threatening, though she occasionally caught glimpses of them moving just at the edge of her vision. Her parents and the doctor had set up a recovery plan filled with therapy and family time, but each hour felt like a fragile step toward normalcy. As she slowly regained her strength, she tried to shake off the memories of the terror that had gripped her life. Her parents kept a watchful eye on her, their love both comforting and stifling. Mandy felt the weight of their concern pressing down on her, but she also craved their support. Each morning, they would sit together at the breakfast table, sipping coffee and sharing tentative smiles, a silent understanding that they had survived something unfathomable. Yet, with each passing day, whispers of doubt crept into her mind. Was she truly free? The thoughts came like shadows, brushing against her consciousness, lingering just long enough to make her uneasy. As the weeks went by, she started attending therapy sessions, where she spoke about her experience with the demon. The therapist encouraged her to express her feelings and fears, emphasizing that healing takes time. Yet, during these sessions, Mandy occasionally caught a flicker of darkness in her therapist's eyes, a shadow that made her second-guess her own reality. It was a brief moment, easily brushed aside, but it left her feeling unsettled. She began to wonder if there were unseen forces at play, remnants of her past haunting her in ways she couldn't yet understand. One evening, while lying in bed, Mandy was jolted awake by a chilling dream that left her breathless. In it, the demon had returned, its twisted visage looming over her, whispering promises of power and acceptance. As she sat up, heart racing, she dismissed it as a mere figment of her imagination. Yet the image lingered, seeping into her thoughts throughout the following days. She resolved to banish the fears that clung to her like cobwebs, determined to reclaim her life and sanity. A few weeks later, her family planned a small getaway to help everyone heal. The mountain cabin they rented was a welcome retreat, surrounded by tall pines and the sounds of nature. Yet, even in this serene environment, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Late at night, she'd hear faint whispers rustling through the trees, echoing just beyond her hearing range, making her skin crawl. Her parents dismissed her concerns, attributing them to the stress of her recent experiences. "You're just imagining things," her mother would say with a reassuring smile, but Mandy couldn't help but wonder if there was a kernel of truth in her unease. As autumn settled in, she returned to college, where she found comfort in familiar routines. Yet, on the very first day back, she stumbled upon an old locker where a classmate had left a note warning her to stay away from the dark places. Confused, she dismissed it as a prank, but the words hung heavy in her mind. What did they know that she didn't? As she moved through the hallways, she felt a strange tension, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, watching her every move. Mandy pushed the thoughts aside, focusing on her studies, but that subtle unease persisted like an itch she couldn't scratch. At college, the atmosphere was different. Friends reached out, eager to welcome her back, but the camaraderie felt tinged with an unspoken tension. Some classmates exchanged nervous glances whenever she entered a room, their curiosity swirling around her like a dark cloud. Mandy attempted to brush off the rumors circulating about her past ordeal, assuring them she was fine, but deep down she felt a chasm between herself and her peers. The laughter of friends was comforting, yet it was punctuated by an undercurrent of something unamenable, a fear that something could still lurk within her. In the months that followed, Mandy worked hard to build a sense of normalcy, attending classes and reconnecting with friends. Yet, late at night, when the world outside her window felt quiet, her thoughts turned dark once more. She'd hear scratching at her bedroom door, a soft but persistent sound that sent chills down her spine. Each time she would jump up to check, only to find nothing there, no shadow lurking, No sign of a presence. The relief would wash over her, but the darkness lingered in her mind, an uninvited guest that refused to leave. As winter approached, Mandy decided to spend more time alone in her room, hoping to gather her thoughts and feel a sense of control. Yet, while scrolling through social media one evening, she stumbled upon a photo from the night of the exorcism, capturing the chaotic moment just before the priest had begun his ritual. In it, she looked different, eyes wide and full of fear, but also something else, something darker lurking beneath the surface. The post had been shared by one of her friends, and the comments were unsettling, some expressing concern, others gloating about her ordeal. It struck her that this image could haunt her forever, a reminder of the darkness she had fought to escape. As she tried to push through, a strange calm settled over her. Despite the lurking fears, she believed she was healing. The whispers in the trees faded, and the shadows seemed to retreat. For the first time in months, she felt like herself again, confident in her ability to reclaim her life. With her friends rallying around her and her family providing unwavering support, Mandy embraced each new day as a fresh start. She had survived the darkness, and now she was ready to step into the light, leaving the nightmares behind and focusing on building a future filled with hope and new possibilities. As we reach the end of tonight's stories on Hauntales, it's time to let your mind drift away. Listen to the sound of the rain gently falling in the background. Let each drop calm your thoughts and ease you into a peaceful sleep. There's nothing to fear now, just the soothing rhythm of the rain. Focus on your breathing, let your body relax, and allow yourself to drift deeper into rest. Sleep peacefully, and we'll meet again tomorrow night for another story. Good night.